morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. I know for lots of you, it's at either afternoon or evening. And so I thank you for joining in this Summer Institute, or the Borders in Globalization Summer Institute. Even though it's late in the day for most of you. This year, we're offering 8 summer institutes, and I created the summer institutes now 4 years ago. My name is Emmanuel Brunet-Jaillet. I'm a professor here at the University of Victoria. I'm also the director of the Borders in Globalization Research Laboratory, which studies borders in 15 different countries. Out of the University of Victoria. We have research contracts with universities, but also with lots of organizations that are not academic organizations, such as the World Customs Organization, the French Agency for Borders, the European Association of Borderland, and so on and so forth. And thanks to these partnerships, in a way, we've created these summer institutes. Originally, it was actually an idea from somebody who worked at World Customs Organization and somebody who worked at CBSA, the Canadian agency. Both of them, the same year, the same summer, said to me that we should do something in policy or policy-driven that would have to do with managing borders, or modern border management. So, what are the modern techniques? How are borders managed in different areas? And so we created the 3 streams that are available today, the three areas of learning, if you want, or outreach, depending on the jargons that you like. And so we have the first course, which is border management. We have the first stream, which is combined basically the course in border management and the border custom. And then you can take AI, and that's a complete stream. And then we create a second stream that has to do with border management and human mobility, which is called also bodies and borders. And you can add to it whatever you want. You can add border security, ecological management, management of indigenous communities. And then the third stream is border management and border law, to which you can also add whichever streams you want. You can add the course that you're taking today, for instance, on border security. Lots of people do this, but you don't have to. So there's basically 3 streams. Next year, there'll be 4 streams. The 4th stream will have to do with border disputes and how conflicts are resolved in borderland. And it's a little complicated to put it together because it's at the juncture of, studying war and peace, but also all the legal issues that have to do with the delineation and demarcation of boundary lines. But I think now we have the expertise and the team, so next year we'll be offering this. You also have, for those of you who are interested, you also have a policy course, which is free. And I think it's offered this week with Claude Beaupré. Claude is an outstanding teacher. She's also a very, very good writer, and she's worked with us now for 4 years. Year in, year out, she has the absolute best teaching evaluation of all the speakers. She's very engaging. And so if you think that, you can learn something in policy writing policy brief or anything like this, in her course, I suggest you take it. Another thing that I would like to say is that some of you have the obligation to write papers. These are the people who are in the course with a tuition waiver or a fellowship. Either way, you should write a paper to get the course certificate. The ones who are regular registrant, right, who have registered in the course, you don't have to write a paper, but you can. If you don't write a paper, but you've attended the course, you have right to a course certificate, and we will give you a university course certificate. It comes at the end of the course, so it will come in September. If you are interested in writing a paper, you should take the course with Claude, and then you can basically write a short policy paper in your area of interest that basically applies to this course, right? So if you are interested, let's say, in any areas, or even doing a case study or learning a little bit more than you've learned in the course, or you want to explore one section of the course that you found really, really interesting, what we're asking is 4,000 words, including a summary, an executive summary, right? And then a bibliography. So it's not a long policy paper, but it allows you to go a little more in depth in this. If the papers are good, we will send you comments. So the obligation is just you write the paper, and then you have the ability to basically graduate with us with a full university diploma, which we call the microcredit. Look on the web, all the details are on the web on how that works. But what I wanted to say about this is that if you write the paper and you're interested in publishing, you may not be an academic, and that is absolutely what we want. We want to encourage people who are not academics, people who work in the public sector, in the private sector, in nonprofit, in border areas, right? People who have an activity related to a border and they write a policy paper with us. We will look at the policy paper to publish it in the big review, the Borders and Globalization Review. It's the journal that the lab has created now 5 years ago. The paper are reviewed blind, right? So we have policy makers or policy decision makers or people who do policy implementation in our network, and they will provide blind comments. So they don't know who you are. They get a copy of your paper and they basically write an email or some comments on the paper, and then we share those comments with you. And either Benjamin Perrier, Claude, or myself, or the three of us, help you finish the paper. There is no deadline for this. The whole idea is just that if you are interested, you want to publish the piece that you've done in the course, you can do that. And we are there to help you. Last year's students, we had 14 students overall, 14 fellows that submitted policy papers. We've only published 4 so far, and we are getting ready to publish 6 more this summer. And I still have, because we've received policy papers, not just through the course, but people know that we are publishing that section. We have 9 under review right now. So, if you write a policy in this course and you want to publish it, you can do it with us. And you can also do it with the Well Custom Journal, for instance. It's more in custom, but if it's not in custom, you can publish it with us, obviously. And it can take a year between the time that you submitted, it's reviewed blindly, comments come back to you, you make the corrections, and then we kind of line them up for publication. So that's what we do. And I hope that the courses are of interest to you, and I hope it's, you appreciate the courses. I think that the team that Christian, Todd, and Jimmy have put together is outstanding. I don't know if you know, but Christian, Todd, and Jimmy have published 2 books on border security. They have 1 book published with Routledge, which is a worldwide overview of security issues at the border. And then they've published recently a book on the Canada-US border, which is quite sophisticated and comes out of University of Michigan Press. So they know what they are talking about. Even though they are not, per se border experts, they are security experts, intelligence experts, and they have studied borders. I think now I can say Todd for the last 22 years or so in different capacities, Jamie as well, and Christian more than 20, so also probably close to 30 years. So it's a great team, and I know you have great speakers in the class. I looked at them. I know some of them directly, personally, and I hope you really enjoy this. So if you have any comments or any questions, we'll obviously survey you. Please don't hesitate to write us. If you have questions or comments, you can write me. My email is in the course package on the Brightspace, right? The web portal that we use to share all the information. I'm sure I'm repeating things that either Todd, Jamie, or Christian have told you yesterday. But I just wanted to say this because I've been told that students were not so clear about how things work, and we have lots of questions about what we're doing and so on and so forth. I acknowledge with respect the Langkwangan speaking people on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees and Vasanek people whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. I acknowledge as well that I am a settler and a new migrant in British Columbia, in this beautiful land. I have lived and worked and enjoyed life on these lands since 2000 exactly, not 1999, which I was going to say. I came for the first time in my life in 1999. And I feel extremely lucky to have worked and lived and played in the lower part of Vancouver Island. It's really been a wonderful experience. And with that, take us away, Christian, Francois. Thank you very, very much for all your work. And I welcome you again. I'm delighted to see that we have a good group in this class. Thanks again.
Francois Fischer did his studies at the Sorbonne and at Sciences Po Paris, and then is a graduate of l'ENA, l'École Nationale d'Administration. So it's difficult to think of a more prestigious sort of educational pathway in the French system. Comes out of the French intelligence community, is a specialist on the Balkans. But his real claim to fame is that he ran. So the European Union has a civilian intelligence analyst mechanism that provides advice to the senior decision makers. And Francois Fischer ran that for 6 years. And I think, Francois, if I recall correctly, it's 72 agencies from the various countries, all with different mandates and different caveats and the like. So you can imagine it's hard enough to coordinate intelligence communities within a country, let alone trying to do this at the EU level. So you can see that Francois is not just a seasoned civil servant, he's also a seasoned diplomat and politician. So he brings a lot of experience, and this is also why the founding members of the Intelligence College of Europe, which is the professional development arm of European intelligence agencies that was recently stood up, elected him as president of the college. And so somebody who has immense experience in the challenges of intelligence sharing, intelligence coordination across borders and across agencies. And so I thank Francois very much for making time for the Summer Institute this morning. Francois.
Dear Christian, dear attendees, as it was said, I have joined the French intelligence service some 32 years ago. I led for 6 years the analytical branch, and I was deputy director of the Civilian European Intelligence Center, and I am now the director of the permanent secretariat. I was more than pleased to be asked by Christian to make a generic presentation on intelligence cooperation and partnership. And as the topic could be really wide, we have decided to concentrate on all the form of cooperation other than bilateral between democratic countries. My speech will take 20 minutes, and I hope will be followed by some dynamic questions. Firstly, I will do a short point on the infancy of structured cooperation inside the modern Intelligence and Security Committee. Please, the next slide. Second, I will make a focus on what I call minilateralism before switching to multilateralism and digging on the various multilateral approaches which have been chosen for cooperation in Europe. And I will finish my speech with the new forms and topics of cooperation which have appeared since around 10 years in Europe. So now the next slide, please. The first forms of cooperations and partnership inside the modern intelligence and security communities. We have here a problem. Exchanging is always a danger and could open your organization to some additional risk of penetration. So it is not natural, especially when you are not from the same culture and when you have to move out the comfort of controlled and balanced bilateral intelligence exchanges. You remember perhaps that at the end of the 19th century, we were stricken by a wave of VIP assassinations. Remember Tsar Alexander II, US President McKinley, French President Sadi Carnot, or, as you could see it on the slide, the Empress Elizabeth, alias Sisi, as you could see here. This has led to the very first multilateral exchanges between the specialized units created inside various security and police forces to fight against violent anarchism. During the Second World War, and the second part of this slide, the basis of what will be called during the Cold War the Five Eyes Agreement was created, as there was a need of smooth exchanges of military or militarily related intelligence to win the war against the Axis. During the Cold War, despite some exchanges inside NATO, both for security and civil reasons on one side, and for military awareness on the other side, there was limited incentive to true multilateral exchanges. There were some structured clubs, such as the Five Eyes, or to give another example, and you could see it below with the image of Africa, with some example linking different countries from various cultures with the Safari Club, which was regrouping some forces around the French External Service to fight against Russian penetration in Africa. I don't know why I've chosen this image and this club, perhaps because it's still an important topic for the time being. Then, as you could see also on the slide at the top, because of the Olympic Games, with the explosion of a second wave of terrorism in the 70s, the Western democratic world was obliged to create different groups and clubs like the Club de Berne or the CTG, which are still existing. This will conclude my first iteration on the first beginning of multilateral cooperation. The minilateral domain has created a dense web of cooperation. It will be really my first big part. I have coined some years ago, while explaining the various formats of cooperation in the French Intelligence Academy, the term minilateral, in order to draw a line between true multilateral and minilateral cooperation. You are in a minilateral format when you work in a small, dedicated group of national intelligence and security services, or in a group of services of the same type working on a specific topic for a certain period of time. It is often set up for a few semesters, maximum a few years, and is generally disbanded after the shared and intended results have been obtained. One example that I want to give to you was a group which was created for some times to control the Syrian returnees going through the different Balkanic borders towards Central and Western Europe, a topic mixing migration problems, border security, or counterterrorism. Another example is on sanctions at the European level due to a crisis. We have often this sort of groups functioning. The cycle is often a cycle of 18 months to 2 to 3 years, with a very active phase during the first year. A group of countries, around 7 to 8, and UK was always included before the Brexit, were leading the work on sanctions. Officially, sanctions are established by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but in the real world, after preliminary meetings of the diplomats giving the framework, which means the idea of the sectors to be targeted and the degree of sanctions, the services of a grouping of willing begin to exchange and establish together a reasonable list using data from the external services, plus data from the customs or the custom intelligence branches, and in some occasions, when possible, from the intelligence financial units, IFU, which are called in the EU system the Egmont network. Then, this group met from time to time, usually mixing intelligence officers of a certain rank, plus intelligence legal advisors to fine-tune or to add new entities and new names. And after a very hectic period where physical meetings are needed, the exchange are done through communication means, and after another period of time, the minilateral group ceased to exist. As you see it, the form of this minilateral cooperation is very near from an expanded version of a bilateral cooperation, and often you could evaluate precisely the positive return for yourself, and it could have some operational consequences. But this is only one form of cooperation, of multilateral cooperation. Minilateral. If I'm going now to the true multilateral, it's the thin topping of a cooperation cake, as I've made on the first slide. In the multilateral format, you are working with a more broader number of countries and services. It could go up to all the EU and all the NATO members on various topics in a permanent and structured way, without direct research of a positive gain, exchanges by exchanges. It is generally sufficient for you if you gain from all the various set of exchanges, be it in terms of intelligence and common vision, or in terms of influence. This multilateral type of communication takes three main forms. First, the permanent large clubs, such as the Bern clubs, which is regrouping all the European internal services working in many domains, or the European Military Club, or the External Services Club, or some technical clubs existing since a certain period of time, very discreetly, on which I will not dig in, but only to mention it. The second form of multilateral cooperation is the structured apparatus of EU and NATO, and this is what is illustrated by this slide. It is regrouped since the last NATO reform under the control of an intelligence assistant SecGen and inside the Joint Intelligence and Security Department division with its two big branches, the Intelligence Production Unit, IPU, in charge of fusing intelligence for situational awareness purpose, and the Security and CI branch, which is known as NOS. For the EU, where intelligence bodies were created after the ex-Yugoslavian management disaster and the 9/11 by Javier Solana, around the EU CITSEN and now EU INSEN Civilian Vision Center and the military EUMS INT, working hand in hand within the SIAC that you see here, the Single Intelligence Analytical Capacity. And you have also some 4 security branches, one for the Commission, one for the Council, one for the Parliament, and one for EAS. And you have a third type of multilateral organized system, which are specialized agencies with very limited technical collection capacities. The EU SATSEN in Torrejon for EU with EMINT and GEOINT, and in NATO, essentially for surveillance, the AGS long-range drone systems, which are based in Sigonella in Sardinia. Having myself worked for NATO and in some of its committees, before cooperating with various NATO bodies while being in the EU, I could dig in, as this multinational format is more complex than the simplified image that I've just given. So this is the agencies, also SATSEN for GEOINT and EMINT, and the long-range drones doing early warning and surveillance purpose in NATO. And in order to give you, this is a slide which is giving you a little more realistic approach of how EU intelligence and security is structured. Don't be afraid. I'll let the presentation for you. You could use it if you quote the originator, but that's it. You could use it because it's quite complex. And even if here it's more realistic, it's still a simplified description. You have only one notion to remember, only one. In a multilateral format, the core of the business is usually done within an intelligence fusion center. The main ones being the IPU that I just described in Brussels-Éveret, supporting the NATO headquarters, the NIFC supporting SHAPE in Mons, and INSEN SIAC for the EU. How it is functioning? Here you could see the scheme for INSEN, but really I insist, it is always the same modalities the same pattern in EU and NATO. To sum up, everybody must give something in terms of finished intelligence analysis. This is the big orange first bubble that you see in the middle. This inputs supported by some OSINT and some extra intelligence existing within your organization, SATSEN mainly for the EU, is fused by a dedicated multinational group of intelligence analysts. And everybody retrieves from the fusion centers the same description of the situation, helping to have at least the same common basis of understanding. So here, an important lesson for you is intelligence is used as a synchronization tool between the different actors. It's not only seen for what it could be, intelligence, but also as a synchronization tool. This information is then not only distributed to the intelligence donors or to the ambassadors, NAC for NATO or the PSC for EU, but also to all the permanent EU or NATO officials to ensure that everybody shares the same global vision. It's the reason why I'm insisting on the role of synchronization between actors. Despite the fact that for various reasons, including the respect of the third-party rules or some differences of composition between EU and NATO, there was no formal or major interactions between the two main multilateral organizations. The development of hybrid threats has led since July 2016 and the EU-NATO Warsaw Joint Declaration to some interactions between EU and NATO intelligence on these topics, as EU and NATO have a very complementary approach and role. I will not dig in on this aspect, which is a very complex one, letting you asking questions if you want, but take note that it is adding a lot of complexity and a major risk of politicization, which has to be contained by the intelligence managers. Last but not least, there is new forms of cooperation that have emerged recently. Since 10 years around, at least for Europe, we begin to see new forms of cooperation, often linked to an extension of the domains of cooperations between services and even in some cases between national intelligence communities and not only individual services. One major point, which is linked to the growing role of the European Parliament and the EU legislation since 2013, and with the investigation committee on the Snowden affair, is the legal cooperation existing between legal departments of intelligence services, justice and police on topics of common interest, such as the EU legislation on data retention, the GDPR, or the content of EU regulations like Tele2 or the artificial intelligence domain. A second one, often forgotten, but major and really time-consuming, is the coordination of what is given as inputs to some international permanent working groups. And you could see here an image of the European Aviation Security Working Group, which exists at the European Economic Area level and not only at the EU level, with its two main subgroups, one specialized on airport security and the other on the transit above war zones. And it was created after the downing of the MH17 in Ukraine. And here you have a lot of inputs to be put there, including inputs coming from the services, and it has to be merged with other data. It's a very complex and time-consuming effort. Second aspect, and you could see here with the logo of the EURM, the EU mission in Ukraine, is the security sector reform, SSR domain, where you mix very often some direct cooperation in a nearly bilateral format, some multilateral supported given to the local services, plus use of some dedicated NGOs to help you to do something, such in this case as the Geneva DCAF. Perhaps you know it, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, but there is other NGOs doing and helping for security sector reform. And it's a very complex domain where you are always in a multilateral format. A third major one is the coordinated and structured exchanges between national control bodies, be it between national parliamentary groups, which are exchanging between themselves, or between national coordination bodies, which are exchanging on practices and other things. It's a third point of cooperation, of new type of cooperation. And last example, created in a new domain, in the human resource and training domain, the Intelligence College in Europe, created with an idea to replicate at the European level and in the intelligence domain what has been done with Erasmus, with the Erasmus program, and with also the idea to emulate the coming together effect seen when national intelligence academies have been created inside Europe. But up to now, I have focused on all my thoughts, and I hope you're thinking also on cooperation between state entities. But another actor is taking a growing role, and we have in many intelligence services dedicated, robust cooperation units to cooperate with them. Often a service could have more cooperation with private companies, as you could see on the second part of the slide, than with other nations. The first evidence domain is linked to cyber. You have, it's mandatory for you, heard about CrowdStrike, which was involved in a little problem recently, but which is also known for its intelligence service, providing some alert and analysis on cybercrime, cyber exchanges between felons and terrorists. You have also perhaps heard about the massive role of a very peculiar firm which could deploy teams on the ground, including in war zones. Its name is Recorded Fischer. It presents itself, and here I will quote its own advertisement, as the world's largest threat intelligence company, and has been, unquote, and has been massively active in Ukraine with hundreds of cyber specialists complementing and supporting the Ukrainian cyber defenders against the Russian hackers. But they are producing also intelligence which could be bought and sometimes which are published. To give you an example of what we could do, they issue on the 9th of July a report detailing the penetration through CCTV cameras of critical part of the Indian electric grid by a China-linked group entitled Red Echo. The second group of actors is linked to all I will call the superstructure, the network companies. Here I flag it with the logo of Starlink. These companies are so vital that any technical intelligence agency have to have some agreement, some contracts, or to find some modus vivendi with them. And now, arriving at the end of my speech, I would like to open a little your reflection. Because of the Internet of Things, and because of the sixth generation, the 6G, we see a huge expansion of non-pure OSINT data, but what we call easily accessible private-owned data or sensitive data used for reporting to some civilian critical infrastructure companies with sometimes automatized exchange between your individual device and the headquarters in China or in Bombay, which could have a dual interest, meaning military or security interest. What do you do in this case? The more easy way is to make it legally mandatory to report to a security-related national body where you could retrieve it. It's not always possible. But imagine if you are not doing it or if you are not controlling the process. Imagine an example, an enemy shelling you and using the weather forecast system and the videos to verify the accuracy of its missile strikes. It's an example of why we must go forward in terms of cooperation with these new actors. And in conclusion, intelligence and security services from democratic countries will have more and more incentive to exchange in multilateral and minilateral formats, and not only between state entities, but also with the private sector. It is, for three reasons, a very big challenge. Firstly, because you have to prioritize always the delivery of intelligence to your national consumers, and by the way, very often financiers. Then you answer your bilateral needs, normal exchanges between services, and multi is always done in a second step by construction. Nevertheless, you have to do it. Secondly, it's also a challenge because there is no direct, immediate, and tangible feedback, especially when you are really in the multi-domain and not in the minilateralism. You must think holistically, globally on the interest for you. Thirdly, because you must have certain human qualities, including intelligence, diplomatic skills, which are not the more developed in normal exchange and bilateral intelligence relations. This is why only seasoned intelligence officers are in charge of such type of cooperation, and why inter alia, the intelligence college in Europe, was created. It is a very complex game, multiplying the possible points of entry and penetration possibilities against you, but it is, for me, simply mandatory to survive in our more and more complex environments. Thank you for your attention. And I am open for your questions.
So they often say that intelligence is the first line of defense. And as you can see, the challenge in the 21st century is with the multiplication, the exponential multiplication of data, the access, the fusion, and the analysis of those data. And I think, as Francois also pointed out, doing, of course, all of that within a democratic and rule of law system where all these entities operate with different mandates under different constitutional constraints, under different legal constraints, and are where the means don't necessarily justify the ends. You also heard some echoes of what we talked about yesterday. So the challenge of coordination, to just actually sharing information among agencies, cooperation, so building some of these parallel structures, and then collaboration, so you can see sort of this building of these joint transnational entities that manifest themselves in terms of the cross-border intelligence sharing component, because I always think that this is partially the way you win in this highly contested world is whoever has better information and is able to analyze that information effectively. Okay, so over to you for some questions for Francois from what you heard. And those might be questions about what you heard, but they might also be, I mean, many of you will come from countries where intelligence sharing is a challenge within your own agencies, let alone with other countries. And Francois, I think this is also a really interesting story about how the very rapid changes in the threat environment since 2016 have necessitated institutions and structures that nobody would have thought possible 20 years ago. So the first question is, the fusion of data from multiple sources may lead to information overload. How can accuracy, relevance, and timeliness of the data be challenging to overcome faulty analysis and decision-making? You'll find the question in the chat there, Francois. So I'll read the question again. So the fusion of data from multiple sources may lead to information overload. So accuracy, relevance, and timeliness of data can be challenging to overcome and lead to faulty analysis and decision making.
Can I answer for this aspect?
Please go ahead.
Yes. Alors, yes, globally speaking, yes, it's an enormous problem. If we are discussing about the work of an analyst. When I was young, I was one of the more, I received quite the more heavy workload of intelligence when I was working on the Balkans. Now, this is I was the champion for a period of time. But now, what I received at that time will be only 1/10 of what is received by a normal analyst. So yes, there is an overload of element, and it's really a challenge for Fusion. First point, you have some qualitative elements and some elements through artificial intelligence. I don't know any service which is not using artificial intelligence, at least to treat some images, is GeoInt image and the OSINT aspect, at least, which is helping. And we have developed some computer assisted systems to help a little, but it's still a challenge. For the fusion centers, from really the fusion centers, the multinational one, the challenge is not having too much intelligence. We receive a lot, we receive a lot of qualitative. The real challenge is timeliness, because it's very simple. You serve first the people who are paying you and giving you orders. So it's your own national decision makers. Second, you use your intelligence the more quicker you could with through exchanges in bilateral exchanges, where it is the top information that you are exchanging. Third, you are exporting it for different reasons to the fusion centers. And the problem is for the fusion centers to have a sufficient level of qualitative information in due time. So here there is a little difference between the different intelligence actors that has to be taken into account. If I could, I see the questions of Eric Topping, and perhaps I could go there also if you want.
Yeah, I'll just let you run with the questions, Francois. Go right ahead.
Yeah. So the fusion centers receive Finnish intelligence. Yes, this is an important topic. Even if there is a certain tendency to give, in some occasions, nearly raw intelligence, but usually they receive only Finnish intelligence and they fuse them together, and they are responsible for corroborating information. But here, the main problem of a fusion center is to come to a common basis of understanding, which will be acceptable to everybody, without going too far in terms of politicization. Because you could have some actors which are providing some intelligence with a too evident political goal. And with the idea that everything will be fused together, they want to influence the end result. So here there is some practical tricks, some ways to mitigate this aspect. It's not so evident, and the corroboration of information is important. Thanks God, very frequently, we have always a group of 7 to 8 countries in NATO, 4 or 5 countries in EU, which are providing qualitative intelligence and are not playing too full with the orientation of their papers. So we could go forward with this, but it's a complex exercise. We could discuss, but I think it's you need a specific time to discuss how to do it. It's quite a complex way of doing it. Yes, when I saw, if you authorize me, I will go to the questions of Kanaga, if I could.
Please go right ahead, Francois.
Yes. Alors, minilateral is usually not really institutionalized. It's existing for between usually 1 year to 2 or 3 years. It's existing because there is a need, and a need which is transcending, which is bigger than one need that could be tackled by 2 countries or 3 or 4 services. And we regroup our forces working on a specific topic for a certain period of time. And yes, this very informal form of cooperation is not totally informal, because there is a name of a group, there is some habits in the groups, there is a trust in the group, and this is an important difference. You are doing a minilateral group only with a trusted friends or people you think will bring in something of a certain quality. In multilateral systems, you are sometimes obliged to play with people who are not giving a lot of added value or are playing some political tricky games. In the unilateral, you really make a group of willing, if I could put it like this, a group of willing working together, and it is more flexible, and you have a lot of it. And I must say, when we spoke usually about multilateral cooperation, usually, and we say that it's increasing massively, and I could tell you since 15 years, it has increased massively in Europe. I don't know elsewhere. Why? Because the multilateral cooperation is still existing and will continue to exist. It's mandatory. But what is really exploding is the minilateral type of cooperation. And it's really creating a web of cooperation between different services and so on, creating a lot of trusted links between people and so on. So it is really nearly operational and really flexible. It's the reason why it is very often preferred to other forms of cooperation. The question on the UK and the EU since Brexit. It's a complex topic, but we have to say 2 or 3 things. First of all, the Brexit is not creating a new border. And in terms of intelligence and security, the channel has never been a relevant border. What does it mean? That if you want to be protected against migration, counterterrorism, CI, you have to collaborate with your friends in the continent. And you have some formats of cooperation, especially the Club de Berne, the CTG, which are made without being made around the EU. So the Brexit is not changing anything in terms of exchanges, in terms of counterterrorism and some other domains, because the clubs between us are functioning. Second point, the services are functioning according to the need of security and not according to the politics. So it means that you could collaborate even if there was some political problems. If there is a need, there could be a cooperation between services. So it's also a mitigation factor. Last but not least, to give you an example, in ICE, the UK is participating to the cooperation. Another example, because of the EU-NATO interactions, the UK is also have some access on hybrid and other subjects and could discuss with the services. And by the way, UK has created the Security Union Task Force of Sergeant King, as was with Mr. Sharpcott, the father of the first Citizen Insen, and was always a very big actor. So a lot of things created at the EU level were created around the EU values. And by the way, the functioning of the INSEN is very near from the functioning of the JIC, if you know it. So there is some easiness, some smooth possibilities of cooperation between us. It is still arming in some domains, but limited one, really limited one. And I will finish with this example. The Aviation Security Working Group that I co-chaired when I was in INSEN is a group which is not limited to EU, but is integrating all the people part of Eurocontrol, EASA, and so on. So UK is still in. And this is very important because you have security above war zones, you have security in airport, you have security towards some city threats. It's one of these examples showing you that there is a good level of cooperation and that the Brexit has not been too dramatic in our security and intelligence relations. Okay, I see a point on Ukraine and Russia. I will, here it's more difficult and I don't want to say silly things, and I have seen it partially in my life, and some also when I was in my service. So now how I could put it without going too much in the details. Globally, it has helped massively to increase the exchanges, with transatlantic exchanges, and the exchanges between civilian and military services from different countries. One of the main problems of cooperation between services is the civ-mil divide. And already, thanks to the hybrid threat, we were obliged to go forward and to find some ways to bridge the gap and to go forward. The Ukraine and Russian has helped us massively to exchange data and elements. For border security, it's far more mixed because you have the use of migration flows as an hybrid threat to make pressure. You could see it in Belarus, and you could see it in Russia with in Finland, or with the Baltic countries, with Poland, with deaths, including deaths of border police from EU border policemen. But here also, I must say, for what I know from what is existing inside the Frontex and some other bodies, there was an increase of exchanges. So paradoxically, I could say that out of a lot of bad and really bad aspects, it has helped to exchange better. I wanted to thank you, and the questions are showing a very nice interest and very nice questions. I let you the slide for elements of I will say explanations. I hope that I have not gone into much detail in some on some aspects, but I wanted to insist on the challenges of coordination, the multiplication of data, and the obligation to work together between democratic countries. And here I will quote the motto of a German intelligence service. I have been myself posted in Germany. The services are not working only for protection of their national interests. They are also working for protection of the democratic values, especially in our countries. And in Germany, the internal service has a very nice motto that I like a lot, which is Demokratie schützen, protecting democracy. And really, I would like to insist on the fact that it's more easier between democratic countries to exchange, and that all the threats that we are facing now are forcing us to have a more, I would say, comprehensive approach of our multilateral and unilateral cooperation. And that will end my words.
I want to thank you very much. Both the quantity and the quality of the questions show, I think, the significant interest in the topic. And I think we'll make sure that we allocate more time as we do the summer school next year on the intelligence side, because this is clearly stimulating significant interest, and your experience is the way you're able to pull this together from a big picture perspective has been exceptionally helpful. I want to thank you because I realize it's also the end of the day where you are. It's almost it's almost 6 o'clock, but luckily we're in France, so it's not quite dinner time yet. So thank you very much for, at the end of the day, taking an hour with the students here. This was very helpful. I appreciate it.
Have a nice time. Bye-bye.
Grand merci.
Bye.
Merci. Thanks.
Rob, can you hear us?
Yeah, hi, good morning, Christian and everyone. Coming in nice and clearly.
So, Rob, I'll skip your very extensive and lengthy CV. So, you graduate of the University of Ottawa, the Royal Military College, the Harvard Executive Program, and Rob has spent time in a number of places in the intelligence community. He has probably the largest collection of intelligence coins of anybody that I've ever seen. You see some of them in the background there in his basement behind him. But it shows you that Rob has taken a real interest in he understands a host of agencies, how they work together, and he's been across a whole number of departments, and not just traditional intelligence departments. So he's also been the chief of staff of the Canadian Coast Guard. So he has experience in not just taking departments that are classic security and intelligence departments, but other civilian departments with an intelligence function. In Canada, for instance, there are 16 departments with an intelligence function. Transport Canada, for instance, has an intelligence function. And in his previous role, he was with Canada Border Services Agency, and he'll tell you a little bit of the work that he did on that, and he'll show you some of the scars that he has on his back from that. He's now in the Privy Council office, which is sort of the department that's the civil service department that supports the Prime Minister in a new role, where he's helping to coordinate the Canadian intelligence community. And he has a long-term interest in professionalizing the community, and is a core member of the Canadian Association of CAPIA. Help me out, Rob.
Professional intelligence analyst. Yes, thank you.
So go ahead there, Rob, and just say a little bit about yourself, and then just jump right in.
Thank you very much, Christian. I appreciate the great intro there. Very on point. And I just want to say good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you all here. My name is Rob Mendoza, and I work for the Privy Council office, which, as Christian noted, is it's essentially the bureaucratic wing of the Prime Minister's office that liaises, coordinates from the center with the security and intelligence community here in Canada, and provides direction and guidance to the entire community. We are also a center where we can resolve conflicts, internal conflicts, whether they be legal, operational in nature, and then we provide guidance in terms of how to proceed forward based on input from senior leadership, including cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister himself. And so I've been with the Privy Council office since the spring of this year. Before that, I was with the Canada Border Services Agency, as Christian mentioned, and I'll get into that a little bit more in my presentation. I don't have a slide deck, particularly because I'm going to be discussing more of my role, both at the Canada Border Services Agency, but also some previous roles, and provide some perspective on that. And so I have worked with 9/10 federal departments and agencies over the last 16 years, most of them in the security and intelligence field. And I'm pleased to meet with all of you this afternoon, as I and many of my colleagues in government really enjoy working and collaborating with my friend Christian on a regular basis, particularly given his thoughtful, sometimes provocative, but yet practical approaches and solutions to modern problems in the security and intelligence field. And so we always appreciate collaborating with Chris, who we regard as a good and well-informed friend in the field. And so before I begin, I just want to note the caveat that the views expressed here today are mine and my own only, and they do not represent the views of the Government of Canada or of the Privy Council office. And so with that caveat inserted, I'm going to note that today I'm going to discuss briefly some cross-border intelligence sharing and border management issues from a Canadian perspective with our U.S. partners, and then briefly cover some of our international arrangements and agreements that we also have in place. I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to keep my remarks somewhat brief, so that we can allow for plenty of space and time for an engaging Q&A discussion. I think there's going to be a lot more value in that. I'll plant some seeds and give you an idea of what we'll cover. And then, I would ask that please don't be sure of the types of questions that you may have. If I'm not in a position to answer them, I'll advise accordingly. However, I will do my best to address everything. And so without further ado, cross-border information, intelligence, and cooperation sharing happens on a daily basis. And this is one of the biggest myths that, people don't always understand, or sometimes when there's an intelligence failure, this topic comes up, but it's actually a myth. Both interdepartmentally, within the Government of Canada, but also across the border with the US and other international partners. It happens on a daily basis. And it happens on a daily basis almost independently. So each respective government department and agency does this and engages on a daily basis independently, but concurrently. And so oftentimes you'll have some institutions like Global Affairs Canada, which is our Canadian version of our department that houses our diplomatic corps. They will keep detailed trackers of all of the engagements that are happening, but they're generally at a very high level. And they won't cover or have a tracking on operational aspects of intelligence and information sharing between respective organizations. And so to give you an idea, here in Canada, our national intelligence institution is called the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, or otherwise known as CSIS. So on a daily basis, you'll have CSIS liaising with CIA, sharing a very large amount of information, a very, very large amount of information and intelligence. The same thing will happen between the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, and the FBI, the Communication Security Establishment, and the National Security Agency. Where I work out of the Privy Council office, we mainly liaise with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. As a matter of fact, I currently have a CIA senior analyst embedded within my unit, and he's working for me as we're working on a special collaborative project. I mention this because it is one of many agreements that we've had over the years where we have a U.S. integree come over, join us physically. He actually sits next to me in my office in Ottawa, and we're leading ahead with a bunch of, with several classified initiatives that we've agreed to with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and with the Central Intelligence Agency. Others that share information and intelligence on a daily basis are CBSA, where I used to work, with the Customs and Border Protection in the US, as well as Homeland Security investigations. There's also public safety here in Canada with the Department of Homeland Security, National Defense with DoD in the US. But then there are others that are less known, such as the Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center, which is housed out of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And now they're a smaller organization that's on the 5th floor over at CSIS, but they specifically focus on terrorist threats and how to counter them, including when you have very senior VIP foreign dignitaries coming into Canada, for example. What's the likelihood that there's going to be an attack employed against this individual or set of individuals? And so they'll conduct those types of assessments, and they'll liaise very, very closely on a daily basis with the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center. Now, there are other interdepartmental efforts where intelligence is shared internationally at cross-border levels. Just a couple of very quick examples. We have what we call the MSOCs, which is the Marine Security Operations Centers, and they have a gauge on everything that's happening on Canadian shores. All of that information, and it's a fused integration center between Transport Canada, the Canadian Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canada Border Services Agency, and then sometimes we have the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service there unofficially, but they do have a bit of a role there from time to time. And all of the information that is collected from these different departmental perspectives is then shared widely with our international partners in the United States. We also have programs such as the Ship Rider program, where we have embedded individuals from either the Customs Border Protection with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to address specific threats or specific trends that we're observing out in the shores between both Canada and the US along the border. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit more of the Canada Border Services Agency context, which is the last position that I occupied. Now, there I was the acting manager for the North American Relations Unit, where I was essentially in charge of 2 teams. One of the teams managed all bilateral relationships between Canada and the United States. And then I had another team that managed trilateral relationships between Canada, US, and Mexico. These are key partners that we engage with. We have strong economic ties, we have strong migratory ties, and from a security lens, we have to all be in sync in order to have a very fluid and promote economic prosperity between the 3 countries. As you know, there's a lot of trade that happens between the 3 nations, and so facilitating that process as much as possible while also accounting for security measures is typically the end state. And then as issues come up, we then address them through different international forums. Sometimes they're televised, sometimes they're not. But my point is that intelligence and information sharing and border management related issues happen on a daily basis all throughout. So for Canada Border Services Agency, for example, we will have different divisions and units, strategic policy to our legal folks, to our operational folks, and then we have what we call an intelligence and enforcement directorate. Each of those respective divisions and branches liaise directly with the United States and their counterparts on a daily basis. From my end, when I was in the international affairs shop, I had a U.S. attaché from the CBP based out of the U.S. Embassy. So we would work together on a daily basis. And then I would work with my counterparts who are Canadians in the U.S. and the Canadian Embassy stationed out of the U.S. in Washington, D.C. And we would collaborate and update each other on what the latest and greatest was in terms of operational requirements, agreements, thorny issues that we had to address. And then we would determine, do we need to raise some of these issues up to a higher level to senior management for them to resolve. But we would always do everything possible to resolve all of the issues at the working level before proceeding that direction. And so to give you some specific examples of collaboration in some of the forms that we would look at and work with and address these issues, we had the Joint Senior Executive Meeting, which is an annual meeting held at the most senior executive levels between the Canada Border Services Agency and over in the US, the Customs and Border Protection individuals. And so we would discuss issues such as fentanyl and opioids. These are we really do have a major crisis when it comes down to fentanyl and opioids, both in Canada and the US. Other issues we would look at were firearms trafficking and general violence entailed with that. Irregular migration, we had quite a bit of movement happening. Traditionally, it was looked upon that it was Mexican nationals entering Canada and the US, but that has completely changed in the last couple of years. Everybody from Colombian, Venezuelan nationals to Peruvian nationals, Guatemalan, Honduran, El Salvadorian, and they all migrate to Mexico and then obtain fraudulent passports as if they are Mexican nationals to make their way over to Canada or the US. And I'll get into that a little bit more closer towards the end of the presentation. There's another forum that we would engage with. This would happen twice a year with our US and Mexican counterparts called the High Level Dialogue on Mobility. And this was created as a part and as a condition of the visa lift. So Canada decided to lift the visa on Mexican nationals in 2016. And so we agreed that we would have this meeting twice a year in order to maintain a status check on what the asylum claim numbers were, what types of migration was transpiring, was there a correlation between increased migration in asylum claims and organized crime or crime levels. How did that impact other sectors? Like the housing crisis was often pinned to increased migration levels. And so we would try and look at these various data points and determine what is the picture, what is happening. And we would then bring all of this information to the High Level Dialogue on Mobility, which was held at the Vice President and President level at the Canada Border Services Agency with their direct counterparts in CBP in the US, and in Mexico, it was called the SRE, which is their version of their diplomatic corps service. Another very important initiative that we were looking at was a passenger name data retention agreement that we have with several countries. This is something that's managed at the United Nations level in terms of what the requirements are for, how long the names and basic information about kept by any respective government. And so, all governments have agreed to this and ratified this that are members of the UN. And to give you an idea as to why this information is kept is, when passengers are traveling to and from any of these respective nations, let's say Canada and the US, let's say that there was an event or an incident on air or a terrorist attack, for example, that basic flight itinerary information will then be used to query internal intelligence databases to find more information as quickly as possible while the incident has taken place. And then find appropriate measures accordingly in terms of how to respond. Another important dialogue that we engage with, where a lot of intelligence is shared, but it isn't widely known because it's a very public-facing forum at the leaders level, is called the North American Leaders Summit. And this is generally held in the US, between the Prime Minister and the two presidents. This happens on an annual basis, and once a NALS date is identified, at the working level, what we do is we get to work approximately 6 months before that's meeting date and engage internally with our intelligence subject matter experts to discuss what operational requirements we would be discussing and negotiating on. We would then put together a comprehensive package for review and approval by our senior leadership, where they would have the opportunity to provide input and course correction based on their vision for their organizations, based on direction given to them by the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and whatever latest discussions they've been having with their counterparts at those very senior executive levels, at which point we would then approve the final list of agenda items that we would be negotiating and discussing at the North American Leaders Summit. So once we would have approval at this stage, weekly meetings with our US and Mexican counterparts to work out all of the details, typically with use of detailed trackers for each intelligence related issue, noting progress, obstacles, whether they're legal or operational in nature. Agreements are then ratified at the working level, typically signed off by a senior member of government at the associate minister level or the deputy minister level, well in advance of leaders being at the prime minister and presidential level meeting in person, which tends to be more of serves as a formality at that point. However, it should be noted that new agreements do stem from these meetings, as leaders will oftentimes commit to working on new initiatives with their respective counterparts. Another very quick example to give you an idea of where we share quite a bit of intelligence, as I noted earlier, from border management, the opioid and fentanyl crisis is at the forefront of our issues. And so we started what we call the North American Drug Dialogue to discuss, what is the composition of chemical precursors? What are we observing? What are we seizing at the borders? What does the intelligence say in seizures and apprehensions that are happening, even if they're not necessarily at the border, but we're discovering in, fentanyl chemical plants where these substances are being created. And after we noted success in that form for a couple of years, we decided to start expanding a little bit with other partners. And coincidentally, we were in an international meeting where our Dutch counterparts expressed some interest. And so as of last year, we started a pilot project where we expanded participation with our colleagues from the Netherlands. We exchanged intelligence, raw intelligence, law enforcement information in terms of what investigations in North America, so that we can better understand the black market of the fentanyl and opioid space in terms of logistical and distribution channels. One of the things that was interesting and quite revealing was that Canada is actually a major source and exporter of fentanyl to Europe, something that we weren't pleased to hear or learn, and that certainly drew a lot of attention and resources devoted to it once those data points were extracted. So this is how we're able to gauge, and we were only able to learn this through our partners, through our Dutch partners, who very politely pointed that out to us, and they were able to back it up with statistical information and raw intelligence. One last example. My team also helped to implement what we call memoranda of understanding, which are essentially agreements between two organizations, two international organizations. CBSA entered agreements with the Department of Homeland Security Investigations, the DEA, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation on all things human trafficking, fentanyl, migration, all of these topics that were at the forefront of the JSOM senior executive level meetings. Now, challenges. I'm just going to go over very briefly, again, cognizant of time, but challenges in information sharing. I'm going to discuss the visa reimposition, which happened earlier this year. So as I noted earlier, a visa was lifted for Mexican nationals in 2016, which was part of a commitment from the current Canadian Liberal government. Since the visa on Mexico was lifted, we noted a consistent rise in asylum claims being made by Mexican nationals. We had established what we thought was a safe threshold of no more than 3,000 asylum claims per year in order for the visa lift in order for the Canadian government not to reimpose a visa requirement on Mexican nationals. Now, to give you an idea of how the situation went from bad to worse, in 2018 to 2019, we saw a major rise, and it actually exceeded the threshold that we had established. And we had 3,993 claims, which was essentially 4,000 asylum claims. By the 2019 and 2020 fiscal year, we saw that number almost double. It actually did double, and it went from essentially 4,000 to 6,691 claims. Then in 2021 to 2022, we saw 4,492 claims, which was a bit of a dip, downward dip, but this can be attributed to the lockdowns during the pandemic where there was no air travel or there wasn't very much movement. Once again, when those travel restrictions were fiscal year of 2022 to 2023, we actually observed a rise again, and we saw 8,398 claims. And this was only from the period of April 1st to November 5th. And so it didn't even capture the entire year. And the stats for that fiscal year actually exceeded 10,000. And so it then became clear that no progress was being made on Mexico's side, and it was determined that we would likely need to reimpose a visa. The Canada Border Services Agency and our Immigration Department, IRCC, were completely on board, and we provided concurrent but independent advice up the corporate chain of command to our respective ministers, which would then make it to Cabinet and the Prime Minister for their consideration. However, this advice was stopped internally by our global affairs colleagues who caught wind of this and used some of their senior leadership to stop this advice from reaching Cabinet and the Prime Minister. And the job of that was that they didn't want to damage diplomatic relations. And I have a lot of stats that I can share with you, but for in the spirit of time, I'm not going to share those with you. But this intervention essentially resulted with more work for the CBSA and IRCC to map out and create an opportunity for Mexican government officials to implement specific measures that we thought may help curb the asylum claim numbers, a lot of organized crime that was entailed with that. However, at this point, the Mexican government was largely unresponsive. And so in the end, we ended up implementing several measures. We liaised with them, but none of these were successful. And eventually a decision was made by the Prime Minister that a visa would be reimposed, which is quite historic in nature because our trade only increased over the last several years since the visa was lifted. But the intelligence was pointing at many other problems. I can't get into those specific problems, but there were other problems, these massive flows of both migration and asylum claims that then now occupy the national security space. So just to very quickly wrap up, because I do want to attribute some time for Q&As, intelligence and sharing cooperation is only going to increase in the coming years. There are new platforms that are also being currently included in the intelligence sharing space, such as all things space and the space domain, and how new tools such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing are being incorporated into intelligence gathering functions. Moving forward, we're going to see more involvement of sharing intelligence with private industry, including academia. In Canada, for example, we have had the issue of foreign interference come up at the forefront with the latest Commission of Inquiry that has not only shown that there's a need to improve internal processes in terms of how intelligence is consumed by senior government officials, because the intelligence is created. They weren't always consuming it or reading it. But also how we use this information even if we need to water it down to declassify so that the information isn't so sensitive, but that can still be shared with other levels of government, academia, and private industry so that they may better protect themselves against foreign adversaries that, for example, are seeking to take advantage of their vulnerabilities, steal their intellectual property rights, which includes millions of dollars of investment into research and development. Again, taking a look at the clock, I think I'm going to stop there just to allow folks some time to ask some questions. And Christian, I have an email that just popped up because I did have a hard shoulder with a meeting at 12:30, but it's been postponed by about 10 minutes. So luckily, so I think we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&As.
If we may, and then we'll just push back our break. And then I've already told we're going to start a little bit later so that you also get a break in. Rob, why don't we start with a question that Benjamin had put in the chat for Francois previously, which is the cooperation between the EU and African countries like Ghana. And as you've seen, we have a number of participants in the Summer Institute from a host of countries that are not necessarily, the classic sort of democratic sort of Western hemisphere. And Ken, of course, has an interesting background in sort of sharing and working with countries elsewhere, in part because that's an important part of protecting Canada's shores and Canada's airspace. Is there anything you want to say sort of beyond the trilateral relationship with Mexico, or also lessons that you can take away from Mexico in terms of how Canada can be both an enabler and the consumer, and the importance of working with other countries that maybe sometimes feel a little bit abandoned by Canada and allies?
That's an excellent question, Christian and Ben, because Canada does play a strong facilitator role at international forums in terms of making countries meet and facilitating the process for them to talk one another more. I think it's quite obvious that there's a greater need. I don't work with our EU counterparts as much, as we have another team that does that type of engagement, but I can speak on behalf of the Five Eyes, and I can say that intelligence cooperation has increased almost twofold as it pertains to the issue of migration. As we all know, there was a lot of disruption that took place in the early 2000s with the war in Iraq, the war in Syria, and such a prolonged war, occupation, whatever you may call it, created massive migratory patterns towards Europe to seek safety. And now we're seeing the end result and the impact that's having, both from how do you, as a national government, whether you're in Germany, Spain, wherever it may be, how do you address and deal with funding issues, societal issues, housing issues for a large influx of people. And then when that's also happening, who are genuine refugees looking for protection and safety. But when those incidents happen, you're going to have foreign adversaries, intelligence services seizing those opportunities, taking advantage of it, and planting intelligence officers and spies to join those refugee camps and those movements, to then come in as refugees into Western Europe and pose as refugees, but then eventually what their true goal is their long, deep plants, who then establish themselves in European countries and start gathering intelligence, start engaging in covert submersive actions. We're observing the same thing in Latin America as well. As I had noted earlier, it isn't just Mexican nationals now traveling northbound to Canada and the US. A lot of nationals from certain adversarial countries that when you look at them, you would immediately question, why are you in Latin America? What's the nexus? But we're seeing a lot of that from two very specific adversarial nations. I'm sure it doesn't take a wild guess to determine what those two countries are. But we have noticed a massive increase in nationals from those two countries utilizing those migratory patterns to exploit those movements wherever they can to gain entry into Western nations. And so as a result, we have had more intelligence being shared in that space. And I just want to note to folks that, you can ask me questions about anything related to national security, intelligence sharing. It does not have to also be limited to the items that I discussed today. This is just a part of my most recent set of experiences, but feel free to ask anything.
Anybody in the chat, or any hands for questions for Rob?
So just to give you an idea of our international presence, where we share intelligence and border management related information, the Canada Border Services Agency has 35 countries that they're engaged with, where we directly send what we call liaison officers that are embedded within our Canadian embassies in those respective countries. And we work on a daily basis with those liaison officers to give us all of the information from a border lens, an intelligence lens as to what the latest and greatest is. It then gets back to all of that information gets back sent back to headquarters. It's assessed, and then from there, it's shared respectively with the wider security and intelligence community in Canada. So that way, when you're occupying the space, you go into your top secret network, and you have thematic areas, whether you want to look enforcement intelligence related information, if you want to look at security and intelligence related information, if you want to look at border management intelligence related information, you have your different buckets of sources of information that come in on a daily basis. And then you can query that to then provide advice accordingly to your senior management.
There's a question online.
There's a question from online there. Can you see the question in the chat there, Rob?
Oh, yes. Okay, great. As per your experience, what are the challenges faced while negotiating agreements within a time frame on border issues with a partner administrations, countries, and strategies adopted to resolve the same? That's a great question. And I'll tell you that it really depends on the country that you're negotiating with. Whenever we negotiate with the United States, and I'll be frank here, and this is, again, like I said, these are my opinions solely, but when the Americans come to negotiate with us, they already established, they know what they're going to negotiate, and then they have tactics as to whether, if the Canadian government rejects a certain proposal, they'll have a backup counter plan on how to still get what they want. And I'll give you a quick example. About 14 years ago, I was negotiating the Beyond the Border Agreement with our U.S. counterparts, and that involved the FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, and then our respective partners. They wanted us to share information with respect to what's called the TIDE network. It's a terrorist identification network that they have, and it's a database of individuals that are bad actors that they then assess and draw intelligence from. So they wanted for the Canadian government to feed information into that network, into that database on Canadians that were suspected of engaging in terrorist activities. Now, we have a legal constraint. Canadians are protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that's embedded in the Canadian Constitution. Just turn over that type of information. It had to reach a certain level of threshold in an investigation in order for us to share anything. So I conveyed this to our counterparts in the CIA and FBI, and they weren't very happy about it, and they weren't having it, and they kept pushing. And then we broke for lunch. And I remember an individual from State Department approached me, and his tactic was actually quite interesting. He said, "Hey, how are you?" Called me brother. "How are you, brother?" I said, "Oh, just a couple of us Latin American guys that made it into the intelligence industry. Pretty impressive stuff." And I said, "Yeah, that's great. And I'm looking forward to negotiating and discussing things with you further." And then he dropped the question again, and he said, Can you guys give us the information that we need for our terrorist identification network?" And I said, "Absolutely not. We just can't. If I was in a position to do so, I'd negotiate with you, but I am simply not capable of doing that." And so that's one set of experiences that you get with our US counterparts. Give you another very quick example. When we negotiate with our Mexican counterparts, you have to appreciate cultural norms and differences. And so for our Mexican counterparts, they had a big restructuring of how they do things because of the cartel issue. So the president there gave all authorities to their version of the State Department to negotiate on behalf of every federal institution in the government of Mexico. So instead of then going directly to our counterpart who deals with border and migration issues, we would have to go through the diplomats, which created further issues in terms of interpretation, in terms of knowledge, corporate knowledge, authorities, and how to proceed, because those in the State Department in the Mexican government weren't fully immersed in their respective governments and agencies and how they worked. There was also a cultural aspect where, like some North American countries, where they would conceptually agree to many initiatives, but then when it came down to implementing such initiatives, our requests would fall on deaf ears, and so there would be no follow-up. We would then follow up, several days later, several weeks later, and we would see no progress. And so, to answer your question, it depends. It really depends on the nation. It depends on the context. It depends on the geopolitical situation. Do they have funding issues? Is there internal or external pressures? Internal would be from their individual, departments and government institutions and senior executives, but then external ones could be, is that government being pressured by a neighboring country not to engage with Canada, not to engage with the United States? And so we have to take all of these things into account, but no set of negotiations is ever the same with any country. They all have their own unique set of variables at play. Any other questions? And again, they can be general in nature. It doesn't necessarily have to pertain to.
There's one more question for you there in the chat, Rob, and that'll probably take you to time anyways.
Oh, great. Are there times when administrations fail to honor the agreements? And if so, how do you navigate back to building trust and ensuring smooth flow of information while at that crossroad? Yeah, so the Mexican example was an excellent one. As I was noting, we weren't seeing a lot of traction from the Mexican government in terms of curtailing some of the asylum claim numbers. We gave them specific operational incentives that they could realistically implement, but they just weren't doing it. And so what ended up happening was trust was starting to erode between our two governments. And so I was asked to fly down with some senior executives to rebuild that trust a year ago. And we flew down and we met with some of their senior leadership. But the problem is that the senior, and they're all for doing these things, but it comes down to the middle management and the working level that sometimes they have more hands-on experience in terms of how feasible things actually are. And they might have budget constraints, they might have resource constraints, not enough experienced people. And so they'll pull back a little bit more. So the senior leadership will want it, but at the working level, they tend to pull back a bit more. They're more cautious, they're more risk adverse. And so eventually we didn't see very much progress. I mean, we tried everything. I brought back with me, we had issues with fraudulent passports. Like I said earlier, we were having nationals from certain adversarial countries using Mexican passports. And you would clearly look at it and go, you're not Mexican. Like, it's quite obvious unless, you became nationalized at one point, but then where's that paperwork? And we also had measures at which we could determine that a passport was fake. But I brought back 14 Mexican passport samples with me from Mexico that could examine them and the new safety features. And we still found that it wasn't good enough. And so we then went back and provided them with some pointers on some biometric information that they could implement to make them as bulletproof as possible. But we found that the pace was a lot slower at which they would respond. So eventually it led to reimposing the visa, unfortunately. And then now we're in that phase where we are rebuilding trust. We're rebuilding that relationship because, of course, many industries were impacted by this.
Rob, do you have time to take the one last question? I understand that you've got a meeting coming up here, so you might need to bail.
I do, yeah. I have another minute or two here. So cross-border enforcement between the U.S. and Canada or between European countries are often highly tailored due to unique geographical, political, economic, and legal contexts of these countries. Whereas in respect of countries in South Asia where borders are countries with varying degrees of political tension, different legal and regulatory frameworks, diverse trade relationships, etc., how to create trust between partners while negotiating partnership agreements. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think you have to do a detailed analysis with each country. And we do this as well. And I'm confident that, countries in South Asia do this as well, where you will create a list of the pros, the cons, and then where can we meet in the middle? And this is going to be a large departmental effort. It won't just be one specific organization that drives these things. You're going to get input from everybody, from every perspective. It'll be from trade, from commerce, from national security, from defense, from general political lens that the diplomats will provide. And then you have to then, encompass all of these considerations. And generally you send it up for senior management approval, or some things will be tweaked so that, you don't have multiple considerations. Sometimes you want to go hard on security, but it may impact your economic relationship. So how do you balance that out? You create these charts where you essentially measure the pros and cons. Some of this stuff we have the classified names, so I'm cautious with how I say it, but that's essentially what it is you're scoping the field. It's an exercise where you're gathering information on what your negotiating country may come back with, and then you build out responsive lines on how to counter those potential responses. But I would say that's essentially how you would tackle that. And I think that even though the level of complexity may vary between one geographic area and another, the process through which these negotiations are conducted tend to be quite similar, because since the establishment of the United Nations, how we approach other countries, a set of normative values has been established on how to ratify agreements and how to get there. The process through which you get there tends to be quite similar, but the variables at play that you look at for consideration will, of course, be dependent on which country you're negotiating with.
So that's a great exercise we can implement for next year's Summer Institute. So maybe I'll work with you on that, Rob. Thanks very much for making time. I know you gotta go. This was terrific, and really appreciate you taking time out and sacrificing your lunch hour to be here.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Christian. Thank you for having me. Thank you to all the students for having me. And I know that with Christian as your lead professor, I have no doubt that you are finding this program engaging, and I wish you all the best of luck. Enjoy.
So Calvin Kirsty is one of the more interesting people I've gotten to know in my life. He's been sort of the man who's been everywhere and dealt with every problem. So he was the senior officer in charge of transnational organized crime for the RCMP. But among his other many sort of skills and experiences, is that he's a highly experienced hostage and terrorism negotiator. Wow. And so for quite some time, the government would put Cal on some of the more complex files when you had to get people in very difficult situations, obviously, to change their mind. Which also means, I think, which probably is also one of the reasons, not just why he's such a good transnational organized crime investigator, but also why he understands this field of illicit flow as well, because I suspect when you're trying to negotiate, you really have to get yourself into the mind of the people that you're dealing with. And inherently, if you're a good investigator, you're able to put yourself into the mind of the bad folks that you're dealing with. And oftentimes those bad folks don't necessarily come from one's own cultural sort of background. So the ability to adapt and to think. Cal now co-runs a consultancy that essentially does risk advising of various sorts to a host of clients around the world. It's also one of the reasons why it's currently in the Caribbean. And I think beyond that, Cal, why don't you kind of just fill in sort of a little bit about your illustrious career and your very diverse skill set and experiences with the aim of, we've talked a lot about the enforcement side, the intelligence side, the government side. So now we're trying to overlay this sort of with a bit of the perspective, sort of like the bad guys perspective, and the transnational perspectives, and the flows perspective, and why the state structures that we have just aren't all that well suited to sort of the flows that we're seeing in the 21st century and the like. So Cal, take it away.
Okay, I sent that presentation, and if you can pull up the first one in terms of the threat environment, and as you're doing that, hopefully time and distance, it gets there within the next minute. But yeah, I'll just add something to the introduction, Christian, because you touched on something I think is really important that I think a lot of people don't factor it in, both in the operational sense or in the academic sense, either or. And that is the human element in terms of, I think, both in terms of thinking and motivation and attributes suitable to the work. I actually grew up in a neighborhood where a lot of my childhood friends that I grew up with at a very young age ended up eventually going in the life of crime. So I had I think, a unique perspective on it, in the sense that some of my best friends spent their lives in and out of prisons, in and out of drug rehabs. And I think, number one, it gave me empathy, that I understood them and the problems, so could interact with them better and more effectively. But I also think, in terms of motivation, um, it assisted significantly in terms of wanting to help and fix the problem. And I think, in terms of thinking skills, it removed what I've often seen in this world, um, is a little bit of a partial blinder in terms of strategic thinking, because of an emotional factor, in terms of us against them. I hate you, I hate this entity. And it quite often became a very personal, um, professionalized approach, versus a more strategic, objective analysis of the problem and the issues, and I think allowed for a broader skill set. So I highlight that point because it was an interesting point you brought up in terms of the human element. But without further ado, yes, I spent 33 years in the police force, and I looked at the class list, and I saw uh, a broad diversity of folks from all around the world, from different sectors, and that. So I feel comfortable talking, because I think there hasn't been a continent that I haven't worked in terms of running global operations. I don't profess to understand the complexity of the world and everybody's own country and everybody's own culture. Far from that. Um, but I'm sitting in the room for the last several days here in the Dominican Republic, with about 100 military officers, looking at the cartel issues in this region, in terms of how to mitigate it, and it gave me time to reflect, in terms of my own background as a Canadian law enforcement, and how that applies to the larger global community, in terms of some stuff that's applicable, some stuff that may not be applicable. But I have to say, after the first day and a half here, and I'm here for 3 days, is that the world's really small these days, and a lot of the challenges, um, and the importance attributes in terms of responding and mitigating the threat, both of those seem to be pretty common, because I did not expect to see the commonality between 100 or 80 Caribbean naval officers that are out on the sea combating the cartels and the cocaine trade around the world. And here, the problems are the same challenges that I often had dealing with my own headquarters, and the cultural nuances and impediments and political impediments and structural impediments that took place. So anyways, without further ado, I think what I'll do is I'll talk about it in two parts today, and I'm going to be a little lazy and use a couple of presentations just as a guideline that I've used in the last day and a half that I've been here, and particularly the second one got significant interest and resonated with foreign partners. But I'll go over the first presentation. I apologize for the graphics and the labels and all that stuff, but it was for this other presentation. So just going to cover, some of what I see important key points in terms of understanding the current threat environment on transnational organized crime and border crime. So I'll ask you to click the slide. And so I'm going to cover these three areas: the evolution of transnational crime, the ecosystem, and the global security, the evolution of crime motives, and some of the influence factors and trends that have seen and currently seeing and anticipate seeing. Next slide. You'll notice my slide presentation is super simple, with just a lot of pictures. The purpose of this slide is that the interconnected of dots, and quite often governments, bureaucracies, organizations, and people try through lazy minds make simplified analysis. And the more time that I spent in this field of transnational organized crime, cross-border threats, and the more access to information that I had, which eventually became problematic in terms of having so much access to information in terms of deep access, that I started seeing a different world, which was common within some people within the intelligence world. And I don't mean the Canadian intelligence world, but I mean the global intelligence world, because it doesn't necessarily mean just because you're in intelligence that you have a good visibility. But I had unique access to both signals intelligence, which is electronic interception of communication, human intelligence in terms of human sources, and then access to law enforcement and other types of enforcement. And the more time that I spent looking, being exposed to that, and being plugged into different organizations around the world, plugged into different intelligence centers around the world, the way that I viewed transnational organized crime significantly evolved in terms of both in terms of complexity, in terms of depth, and in terms of the interconnectivity of it. And that's kind of the point that I want to make, that I can find just because a person spent X number of years in law enforcement or intel or in academia looking at it, the shape and the analysis is defined by the access of information. And if you had limited access to information, it means your worldview was going to be X. And if you had massive expansion or massive access to information, your world was going to be Y. And I say this half jokingly, half seriously. The people that I know had the best access to the information would, in jest, jokingly say they didn't want to have that access because of what they saw was happening in the world was very troubling and very concerning. And I remember years ago, well, not that many years ago, probably about 2015, I was sitting in my office when one of my colleagues came up to me, and he said to me, he said, "Hey, I have a couple of my friends from international military intelligence units in town, and we're doing XYZ in terms of visits and looking at different things. Would you mind, having a conversation with them and meeting them?" And at that point, I was a senior executive in this world of transnational organized crime in the federal police. And it was kind of like the right diplomatic organizational thing to do. So I sat down with them for about 15 minutes. We kind of hit it off. These guys seemed really, really impressive. They're all PhDs with law degrees, which really impressed me. And as the conversation evolved, they asked me to go into the, or I was asked by my peer saying, "Hey, Kelvin, would you be willing to share with them a briefing, if you have time, in terms of our war rooms?" And our war rooms were our operational rooms where we had our ongoing investigations that we were running around the world, mapped out through link chart analysis and pictures and photographs in these large rooms. And I had about 3 or 4 in this one office space area. So I said, sure. So we go back in the room. I just met these guys like 15, 20 minutes before. They were from Washington, D.C. and London. We sat down. I went around the room and showed them what we were seeing. They came back and they were with the Office of Naval Intelligence in the U.S., which is an older institution than the CIA and a very robust one. And you can imagine thinking that, just kind of a side point, is that 90% of illicit trade in the world moves in the marine sector. So who are the likely ones to have really good visibility would be the marine sector. And in this particular case, it was US military intelligence, US naval intelligence, sorry. And they probably, in my humble opinion, had access to information and visibility on information because of their capabilities that were off the charts. And in the discussion at the end of it, they said, this is, you, Kelvin, and your group here have the most unique visibility on transnational organized crime we have ever seen in law enforcement in this room based on this. You see exactly what we see, which most people don't see. And my response to them was, I'm more interested in unseeing this. And they started laughing and giggling because they realized why I didn't want to see it. Because when you saw what we saw, the rest of the world, not just the civil society, but even in the security and intelligence society, didn't have that access to information. So it meant that my worldview, if you think of it from a conflict perspective, was different than everybody else's conflict. And our unit was always kind of going, hey, the threat actors, that the vast majority of, say, for example, Canadian law enforcement we're looking at were X and Y, say, for example, Hell's Angels, which was the national priority at that time. And what I was seeing was the cartels, the Chinese triads, and the Iranian networks. And I had been seeing those for the last 10 years, but all the national priorities were disconnected with that. So I share that story because it was a lot of frustration, but it really highlighted, the information or activity, and or it's troubling, when you identify new threats in these complex networks, and that's in my career. I'll go to the next slide. So one of the things that, because of the way that governments are designed, law enforcement, intelligence, etc., is designed based on mandates, based on policy. And one of the great things and important things in terms of combating transnational and organized crime is the inclusion of structure. But what I would highlight that sometimes structures actually blind us in terms of understanding the threat because of mandates and that. So say, for example, when I was in transnational organized crime and we were looking at different issues, my visibility on that top circle of cyber was relatively blind. I was fortunately very, very fortunate in most areas to have exceptional visibility on the illicit finance circle. But a lot of these other circles, I was blind and void of. And it wasn't until I got out of the government structures, which was shocking to me, and working with law firms and the business community and that, where I started to see a clearer picture of the interconnectivity of all of these threat vectors that I have in those circles, ranging from terrorism to information, to kinetic, to cyber, to all those particular threat vectors. And although I saw glimpses of them in the organization, the clarity really came once I got out, and I wasn't constricted by mandates and going, hey, I show up at the office at 8 o'clock in the morning. Here's your task. Here's this. Here's your projects. This is what you're responsible for. It's when I got outside and I started working more and more. And I was fortunate inside. I started seeing a little bit of this inside. But when I got outside and I'm dealing with victims more, i.e. corporations, NGOs, law firms that are under attack by foreign entities, foreign, criminal activities. I was able to kind of see things with a greater clarity. Now, that's the inner circle. And what was really impressive in the last couple of days is the conversations here on the ground, in the hub of some of this criminality, i.e. the Caribbean operations with Colombia and others that are here in Peru, et cetera, et cetera. They see the same stuff on the ground as well. But I found as a Canadian, we seem to struggle seeing the interconnectivity of some of this stuff for a number of different reasons. Bureaucracy would be one, and there's probably a host of other reasons I'll get into here, but I won't get too deep into them now. The other thing that I put in that picture was foreign states. And in about 2007, if you look at the FBI, or 2008, if you look at the FBI's most wanted list, and most Canadians, and I talk about the impediments of the mind in terms of processing information and analyzing information. But if you look at 2008, the FBI most wanted list, number 1 on the list was Bin Laden. Number 10 on the list was an Iranian Canadian. But that person got no attention from Canada almost at all. But the world recognized he was a threat, but Canada, I would suggest, didn't. The Americans recognized he was a threat, and even though he was based in Vancouver, they didn't. Fast forward, at that time, we started researching and looking at those threats. And fast forward to, 2 months ago, where I just looked at the disclosure material out of the court case of Cameron Ortiz, who was a senior intelligence officer for the federal police in Canada. You can see that a significant amount of the concerning activities between one of the most significant cases in Canadian history in terms of national security and engaging with threat actors, that the vast majority of the concerns and allegations in the court were relative to the Iranian network. Now, coincidentally, in 2008, when we saw the emergence of these threats in Canada, and we brought them forward to Ottawa, and I had a meeting in the morning at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning to brief up on these threats, and got exceptional feedback in terms of this is super important, well respected in terms of the work that our teams did back in BC. As a result of the success of that briefing, we went for lunch. We came back from lunch, and they introduced me to my new point of contact to work on these threats. And that new point of contact was Cameron Ortiz, the suspect in this personal network, which led to a whole nother story. So I just wanted to talk about the both the states, and you can see the state of China, state of Russia, South Korea, Iran, and I state it for respectful purposes. I'm talking about the state. I'm not talking about the people. And what we always saw was a unique relationship between these criminal networks that originated from there and with state actors that were either suspected to be government officials or appeared to act like government officials. And I know there's significant controversy in Washington, D.C. over the last 2 months, where they had various congressional hearings relative to the role of the state of China as it relates to fentanyl. But some concluded there was a relationship, others concluded maybe not, and that. But I think as the world's getting more polarized, Canada and many democracies in the world see government and criminal networks as separate entities. Foreign states actually see them as possible useful tools and mechanisms to accomplish their political states. And if you look at, say, historically China, where the military there wrote a paper on unrestricted warfare, you'll see in unrestricted warfare, which is like a doctrine in terms of geopolitical warfare, that transnational organized crime is considered a useful weapon in global conflict by some states. Not so in terms of, from obviously Canada and many others, but some states see it as a useful weapon. Next slide. All about the money. And I say this with the greatest respect. And it was probably in 2000 and, it was probably 2007, 2008 when we first started looking at the Iranian networks. Then we looked at the Chinese networks. But a great case was a major international heroin case that originated out of Tanzania. And I'm trying to think of his name for a second. Scuba is his name. If you Google the name Scuba from Tanzania, heroin kingpin, you'll come up with a U.S. website on him. And I think it was about 2012, I was approached by Ottawa and asked to take the lead in terms of mitigating this with the international community, this threat actor. And what was, he was moving apparently 1/5 plus percent of the world's heroin coming out of Baluchistan, which is the area out of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. It's a tri-border area where most of the heroin in the world was coming from. And what really found unique working that case were all the people that we were targeting had no assets, were staying at hostels, were staying here. And these people were in the movement, this network, moving in the tonnage there. And if you Google, again, Horn of Africa in this period, 2012, 2013, 14, and go Horn of Africa, heroin seizures, Canada, Australia, Britain, or whatever, you'll find that they're like frequently seizing tonnage. And these people were part of that network, and they were selling bricks of heroin and bricks of cocaine on a regular basis. And they were staying in youth hostels. And so what I learned when I took that case, compared it to some of the Iranian cases and the flows of money, the flows outside of Canada, in terms of flows of money, I recognized that my time in the money laundering world, when I was the ops officer of money laundering and proceeds of crime, that the old saying, it's all about the money, it's not. I would say it's about the money for sure, but it's also about something else. And I'll just go to the next slide. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're good. Thank you, Cal.
Yeah. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. Got it. And you can see the shadow image. It is about the money for many. And it's not an either or. It's, I would say, at the higher levels, with particularly those networks I highlighted, the Iranian networks, the Chinese networks, and the Russian networks, it's also about power and control. It's also used as a strategy for global conflict. And that's where we were seeing an increasing, when we got more and more visibility and going to the higher levels of transnational organized crime, we saw that it was also infused with geopolitical interests and purposes. If you ask me about the cartels, I'm working the cartels, and I was intimately involved in Chapo Guzman's case, and probably 50 other cartel operations, maybe 100 other cartel operations in Canada. Um, that quite often we didn't see any geopolitical interest. But what we did see was they were connected to interesting geopolitical entities. Say, for example, when the cartel showed up in Canada, they did not meet the Italian mafia. They did not meet the Hells Angels. They almost exclusively met with the Iranian networks. These Iranian networks would often travel back and forth to Iran. And there was a lot of suspicion and indications and intelligence that some of them may have been agents of the state. The same transcended to a certain degree with the Chinese networks as well. So I highlight this because the narrative, in the whatever 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s was, hey, it's all about the money. And I used to be think that. But we did see, and I think as the world's getting more and more polarized, it's also about a power, and it's also about what the capability of transnational organized crime provides threat actors in foreign states. It provides a disruptive capability in terms of flooding the streets, say theoretically with fentanyl. It provides a money generating opportunities for foreign states to move money across borders for the to support secondary operations, whether those secondary operations are electoral interference or corruption or counter-proliferation activities, i.e. buying illicit products for the purpose of military interest, et cetera, et cetera. And also for economic subversion and coercion of taking those profits and not necessarily, hey, just doing it for the money. With their intent is to immediately invest in critical infrastructure, whether it be mining, oil, gas, ports, port equipment, or whatever else. And we saw that periodically, where we'd even see fentanyl traffickers investing their money in the oil fields in Canada. Next slide. Risk. I was asked this slide when I came to the class, where do I see the risk going? I see the risk going, totally up. I don't see anything on the horizon that is going to mitigate the risk. Why? Because the increase in globalization, the geopolitical polarization that's happening in the world, where this becomes a useful weapon in terms of geopolitical polarization and global conflict and security. Technology is increasing in terms of not only in terms of, say, where we focus on the state, but criminals' access to technology is also increasing. And we're seeing that, in major drug shipments where they have the radar technology and capability to detect if there's unusual ship patterns on the open seas, where there could be navies and others that pose a threat to them, and they'll just have the whole ship rigged to burn it down, dump all the cocaine in the ocean and burn the ship and jump in the water with their life jackets, knowing that foreign entities are watching and will rescue them. And then communication, and Canada in particularly probably has the world's worst reputation in terms of facilitating secure communication to transnational organized crime networks all around the world. And if you look in Europe in particular, you'll see that most of the major cases, including those cases associated with Rotterdam, Antwerp, which are becoming the new hubs of cocaine and synthetics, that most of those threat actors are have been using Canadian technology in terms of communication to protect their operations, making it difficult for the police, intelligence, and others to know that. and and not only at an operational level, but I would say that last one I mentioned, and I say this for the Canadians, that it basically has blinded, I think, everybody because of the heavily use of SIGINT, signals intelligence, in our country, CSE in the US, NSA, which is governments heavily rely on it. And what the dots didn't seem to be that well connected, that Canada, and specifically Vancouver, was the hub. And if you look at the transcripts that recently got released out of the Ortiz trial and you do some corporate research, you'll probably find that the world's vast majority of encrypted illicit phones were based out of the Vancouver area. So when everybody, and we talk about the interconnectivity of all these different things, and you go, hey, why was it ground zero for fentanyl? How did we miss that? Why was it appear to be kind of ground zero for money laundering? How did we miss that? And that was probably because of these communication phones, where they're using secure communications to conduct their operations across borders. Next. I think quite often, in terms of transnational organized crime, and I've been on some panels here recently, and even reflecting on my post time in operational settings, we always focus on the guy on the left, the criminal, and I don't think we've done a really good job in terms of looking at how the critical infrastructure, both illicitly and licit, in terms of who owns the ports, who owns the equipment in the ports in terms of technology, who has access, can you hack that, can you get through the back doors of that stuff? Are those people that own the critical infrastructure through networks and relationships, and even possibly through legitimate laws of foreign governments, i.e. China has national security laws, and if their laws not theoretically, but in reality, they can task a dual Chinese citizen in a foreign country to do whatever they say if it's in their national interest. And we've seen a host of issues around the world, from foreign police offices to threats, intimidation of diaspora, to using foreign operatives, to get into electoral interference, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't, and it's interesting, we don't have that much conversation about the critical infrastructure, who's buying the ports, who owns the ports, and who has access to the technology and the critical infrastructure to assist and support the facilitation of transnational organized crime and crime across borders. And, here in the Caribbean, where if you read all the newspaper articles, most of the critical infrastructure is being bought up by foreign entities. And those foreign entities, in many cases, have been deemed as foreign adversaries of many of the democracies that are out there. So I just highlight that I think sometimes we focus too much on the person and we're not talking about this other stuff. And the question is, hey, why? Why are we not? Probably because there's a financial interest by some sectors within nations to facilitate and receive the profits and the money of foreign investment. And I think that's been a historical problem Canada has struggled with and still struggling with. And I think many other nations are, based on the conversations having this week down here as well. Next one. So 3 considerations to mitigate transnational organized crime in my experience. Awareness. And I have probably been one of the most highly critical or highly criticized persons for being very vocal about it. I remember in 2014, I my organization heard that I was headed out that night to UBC to do a talk on transnational organized crime. And at that time in 2014, the first slide I had, and you can Google it, you'll see it because I still think it exists on the internet, was are we on the Titanic, transnational organized crime, with a ship hitting an iceberg at night. And we were just starting to see some major money laundering issues. We were starting to see some of the fentanyl. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think fentanyl just had started, and then carfentanil started after that. And I got a phone call that afternoon saying, "Hey, we hear you're going out to do a talk tonight." And this was Ottawa was calling me. Why are you doing that? And I said, well, the same reason we send a police officer and community policing officers to go talk to the school about locking up their bikes in terms of prevention and awareness. I said, it's the same kind of model, isn't it? And the conversation kind of evolved, and but it basically highlighted that talk about stolen bikes, don't talk about transnational organized crime, and probably a number of different reasons. One, they didn't want to cause anxiety. Number two, they're probably ill prepared to deal with the emerging fast pace and fluidity of these foreign threats. So they were a little nervous going, hey, if we highlight the problem and then the people come back and say, what are you doing about the problem? And we're not prepared for it, some political splashback. But having said that, having worked also in Europe quite a bit, and as I mentioned about the importance of humility in terms of dealing this, when I worked in the Baltic states about 3 years ago, I was over in Latvia doing a talk for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Center, which is a large reputable media group of about 200 global, 300. I don't know what it is. It's been a couple of years. But they were working with foreign states, and their whole strategy was push it all out, advertise it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and put a spotlight on the threats. And the best thing, just like for any other wound, is sunshine and light. And I'm a big believer in that. Yes, it has some political consequences, but the subsequent political consequences of not doing it, i.e. failed democracies, are much more significant than some tough political questions. And some embarrassing stuff is, hey, we may not be well positioned for this. We may not be that. But the only way we move forward as nations to protect our democracy and our systems and our people is by having these public conversations. So that's awareness tools. I think particularly governments, procurement, budget, and I just think the fast pace of technology, I don't think large organizations can keep up with technology. And I find in the private sector, it moves much faster, like at lightning speed. But there's a lot of technology out there in the space of transnational organized crime that I've seen in the private sector. And the whole afternoon today and tomorrow is all about technology and transnational organized crime and cross-border issues. That's really a key part of the future, is looking at the technological capabilities that are out there. And yes, there's risk of using technology, but there's a lot more, again, risk of not using technology. And then the last one is enhanced capabilities, and that's partnerships. Partnership stuff, somebody came to me after I retired, a young analyst, and said, hey, Kelvin, ever since you left, we don't seem to be working globally like we used to. What did you do? What was your secret? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they were like searching for some strategic and intellectual thinking that I had. I had nothing intellectually superior to anybody else. I was just an average guy in there, but I had two factors. One was humility, as I mentioned, and that humility allowed me to work with other people. And I didn't have a self-interest, and I talked about those other personal humanitarian or humanistic qualities that I got from my childhood, where I was just trying to do the right thing for the right reason. And I wasn't looking for the promotions. I wasn't looking for, hey, getting the headlines for the bosses or whatever else. I was out there working in the world and completely focused at mitigating the threat with no other agenda other than threat mitigation and protecting the people in my country. And I think if I was to say, like I said to him, I said, there's no secret intellectual strategic approach to this other than developing partners. And I could probably talk for another hour and a half just about partners. But I turn it over to you for questions, but I just highlight partnerships are so important.
So we have 3 questions in the chat here. So I'll just go through them, and so you can take them one at a time. You can also see them in the chat if you click on the chat, Cal, and you scroll to the bottom of the chat. The first comes from Trudy. How can law enforcement agencies in the Caribbean better train and equip their officers to deal with the complexities of transnational organized crime?
So I worked with Australia. I actually just gave this example today to the group. I worked with Australia in 2007, 2008 in Africa, working terrorist operations. I was so impressed. I then got exposed to some of their programs. I think actually probably in 2000. I was so impressed. And I got exposed to, they had a professional exchange, best practices, lessons learned, professional development program, i.e. a structured program to go out there and learn best practices from foreign police agencies. And, it wasn't just spent at the executive level, where I see quite often it is, and go, hey, a whole bunch of police chiefs are getting together and they're going to sit there and drink booze and drink, shake hands. No, these were operational people, young people that were up and comers, that were high performance, highly dedicated, that were selected because of their potential. And then they were on programs going around the world as organizations and institutions, gathering those, coming back, having to write a paper to say, this is what we have to do to advance our country and our programs relative to these type of threats or activities or whatever it may be, transnational organized crime, international kidnapping, whatever it is, and instituted them. And they created the network and the partnerships through that travel, but they gathered the knowledge and the lessons learned. And then because of the way it was structured in their own organizations, this program, all that stuff went to the senior executives to then execute what was learned and that. And I thought that was a super great one in terms of how to build the capacity of the team. And Australia, like they've just been on a rocket ship, I think, as a federal police force, compared to, say, other organizations that are a little more in a slow mode. So that's one example.
The next question from Anthony: in illegal financial transfers, how would you handle cryptocurrency?
I don't profess to be a real tech guy on that, but I know we always look at, and it's always been one of my respectful pet peeves, where we look at the illicit transfer of money and we narrow the scope of it to the actual financial transaction from point A to point B versus looking at it, well, let me rephrase that, from point B to point C. And we don't look at it from the starting of the spectrum from point A to point B, i.e., where did that money come from? That money came from illicit activity. It's part of the money cycle. So rather than looking at just that cycle in terms of the crypto, where did the money enter the crypto, and maybe pushing out, looking at where's the money coming from. So when I sat down with the current premier and others, at the beginning of the Cullen Commission in Canada, I said, I don't think you can look at illicit financial activities without looking at where the sources of the money is coming from. Because if you do limit it to, say, hey, just that crypto, at some point there's cash moving in there, and maybe they needed to expand beyond just that point, whatever it is, point B to C, and take in point A. Maybe the reality is it's point, M to N, and they need to look at the whole spectrum of the money and see where the vulnerabilities are in the movement of the money. And crypto is not the easiest place to hit.
And the final question, what are indicators that transnational crime is connected to a state actor?
Difficult. Indicators is something that I always use. I don't use evidence. And as I was told years ago when I was working in Israel, if the Israelis waited for evidence in terms of dealing with threats and threat vectors, they wouldn't exist past whatever it was, 1939 or 1949 or whatever year they became a country. And I was sitting at a table with a bunch of Israeli intelligence. So if you're waiting for an evidentiary level, which, you look at all these, a lot of the people making these policy decisions, influencing policy, evidence, and they devalue intelligence, and intelligence as indicators, as you've kind of properly framed it. I think you have to really look at it at a long time and go, okay, at what point are these, I'm just using an example, are these Iranian dual Canadian citizens pulling out their AK-47s and going into parks in Vancouver and firing off 150,000 machine guns, killing a bunch of people, and then several days later jumping on a plane, going back to Iran, hanging out there for a month, and then coming back to Canada, and then doing the same thing the next month, and then going back to Iran for 3 months, and then coming back to Canada, and doing the same thing again and shooting a whole bunch of people and going back to. Listen, I worked Iranian intelligence. I lived in the Iranian community because my ex-wife was Iranian. You can't wear a miniskirt in Iran, never mind going around the world assassinating people in and out without being checked at that airport when you come in. So at some point, somebody said, hey, it's okay to come and go. So each case is very specific, but I just go, okay, because that was a real case. And I went, guys, you cannot move in and out of Iran unless you do that. And you go the same thing with China in terms of like fentanyl and going back and forth between countries and going, hey, the capability, it's like, I know if I went to China tomorrow, I would immediately be arrested. So if all these fentanyl traffickers are going back and forth, it raises the question. And I think then you just have to look at the complexity of the indicators and go, hey, is this a foreign state actor, or is this somebody that's willfully turning a blind eye, or has this got nothing to do with the state? So it could be in any one of those particular ones.
This is probably a good place for us to wrap up. Do you want to throw any kind of concluding comments from you to pull it all together and to leave the participants with some thoughts?
Yeah, 2 quick comments. 3, the partnership. But the partnerships, and particularly for the Canadians and others that are working in national institutions, the biggest impediment that I had that really bothered me in terms of being successful to mitigate these threats were not having common metrics in terms of measuring success. So each organization, each country measured success different ways that didn't allow us to collaborate and cooperate in terms of a partnership. In other words, at the Cullen Commission, hey, how many guys were arrested and convicted in Canada? And the number came out was 2. But they wouldn't allow me to expand on that and go, but I probably like 200 around the world, or maybe 500 around the world. But that's where all our efforts were. At the end of the day, these people don't care about borders. They're completely irrelevant. So if our organizations and our institutions care about borders, they are becoming the threat and intertwined with the threat actors themselves, because the threat actors don't see borders. So when we looked at things, we were looking at, hey, we don't care where the borders are. We hit them the furthest place we could hit them from our borders, and we didn't really care. And we were looking at efficiency and effectiveness of our operations with our budgets to mitigate it. We weren't looking for headlines. We weren't looking for old school metrics of domestic crime, or hey, unless a person's charged and convicted in our own jurisdiction, didn't really matter. And in the room today, they all get it. I don't know if Canadians truly get it. I don't know if our policy centers get it. But that type of thinking in terms of appreciating how the threat actors think, they don't care about borders. We can't care about borders, and we can't care about, the politics and politicizing the successes of it either. The last thing I'll say, as this is a wicked problem and not a problem, the most important thing I think to bring to the table as a person working in this is humility, because these threats change, are complex, are fluid, and being constant learner, constantly open mind, checking your biases, working with other people and supporting other people, I think is probably, when somebody said, hey, Kelvin, in 2016, you got nominated and selected and awarded International Policeman of the Year, first time the Canadian Chiefs of Police did it. If somebody said, Kelvin, how did you get it? I would say, I would like to think that it was my humility in terms of working with the global community.
Calvin, that was fantastic, because we got a lot of sort of play-by-play over the last couple of days. And I think this was sort of the color commentary to help people understand sort of how the big picture connects. So that was super helpful. Thanks very much for finding time, because I know you're fully tied up there in the Dominican Republic with the work that you do and trying to help the neighborhood with the significant challenges and sharing your expertise there. So thanks for doing double task and double time here with us for carving that out. We'll take an hour's break now, and then we'll come back at the top of the hour for students. Thanks again, Calvin. Applause from all of us.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I spared you my picture for the whole thing. So you're probably fortunate that the computers didn't work. So thank you.
Really looking forward to this next presentation here. We are looking at human mobility and border security. So we've got a really interesting duo here presenting with us. So first up, we're going to have Richard Saint-Marseille. So Richard is the Director General of the Immigration Policy Division, with Canada Border Services Agency. So he's been there for over 19 years, but has held a variety of roles from officer to management to executive levels within the Government of Canada. So a wealth of experience there. He's also done a lot of work around initiatives related to immigration, refugees, controlled substances, customs enforcement, intelligence, external review, and cabinet parliamentary and regulatory affairs. So he's got a really, really broad range of experience working with other partners in border security as well, which is something that we've been talking about extensively here, and we'll bring all of that frontline and executive insight to the talk today. So we'll welcome Richard in a minute here. So I believe Richard's going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to do some questions. And then we're going to go to our second speaker, who is Duncan Paisley, and he's also with Canada Border Services Agency for coming up on 20 years himself with the agency. He's at the Calgary Airport currently. Duncan was also posted to Montreal and the local land border for refugee processing posts. So he's got a wealth of experience there. He's also really involved in writing training material and delivering training across Canada for the immigration program and the global case management system. So Duncan also worked as a visa officer over in Singapore and as a hearings officer in Calgary. So he's a document analyst, a minister's delegate, and a field training officer. So Duncan has a huge amount of experience in what we're talking about here. And I think these two speakers are going to complement each other quite nicely. So looking forward to the insights. All right, without further ado, I will turn it over to Richard. I assume you can hear us okay. If you want to pop up, I've got your PowerPoint as well. So just let me know when you want me to start sharing that.
Great, yeah, can everybody hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect, thanks. So I got to apologize in advance. I thought I had a little more than 20 minutes, so I'll have to improvise and fly through some slides. So
take more if you want. That's okay.
No, it's all good. It's all good. We'll fly it. We'll fly it on the fly. Okay, great. So are we waiting for anything else, or should I get kind of started here?
You go right ahead.
Perfect. Okay, thanks so much. And for the slides, are you taking care of them? And we'll do it that way, yeah?
Yes, unless you'd prefer to share them.
No, that's totally fine. If you want to put it up, that's great.
Excellent. Just give me 1 second here. There you go.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks for the invitation, and nice to see everybody. So I was planning to get it pretty in depth on the legal and technical side of the Canadian asylum system, but like I said, maybe I'll fly through it a little bit faster. There's a lot of material to cover in this particular presentation, so I'm happy to take any questions either during the session or after the session if people have any questions. The focus of my talk is going to be on the Canadian asylum determination system, particularly with a focus in Canada and the role of the Canada Border Services Agency in that process. In Canada, the asylum system is governed predominantly by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that has several objectives, but the principal objective related to asylum is firstly about saving lives and offering protection to displaced and persecuted persons. And as we'll see through more of the presentation, it has significant public safety and border integrity related considerations as well for Canada and countries around the world. So on the second slide, I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just an overview of the Canada Border Services Agency's mandate. It's a very broad mandate, particularly with respect to immigration and refugees. Our minister, the Minister of Public Safety, is responsible for ports of entry, enforcement of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that includes detentions, hearings, investigations, and removals. Policy responsibility for inadmissibility grounds for serious reasons related to, for instance, security, human rights violations, and organized crime. Granting relief from those inadmissibility grounds where it makes sense to do so and not in against Canada's national interests. And with respect to asylum, as we'll see throughout this presentation, the agency has a considerable role that's often not well understood by the general public. On the next slide. So this slide just gives you a bit of context. So I'm sure most of you know globally migration's at an all-time high. In terms of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in 2003 noted more than 100 million people living in countries that are affected by conflict and persecution have led to mass migration movements. Governments across the globe, including Canada, are facing unprecedented challenges in terms of flows across borders. And in addition to international instability in some regions, additional migration flows are also being fueled by issues related to climate change and the environment as well. And just a little bit of data here, 155 million people was the migrant movement in 2000, and then it's raised to 258 million migrants on the move by 2018. So it's the migration movement's been relatively constant over the years at 2.8%, but as a percentage of the world's population. But as you can imagine, with the growing population, those volumes tend to increase significantly year over year. So on the next slide, here's some data that's specific to the Canadian context, and so. If you look at the chart on the lower right-hand quadrant, that will give you an illustration of the growth trend we're seeing. So from 2015, under 20,000 refugee claimants that arrived in Canada, and last year we've surpassed 140,000. So a significant increase in a relatively short period of time. And one of the other significant increases and impacts for Canadian border integrity, but also for policymakers generally in Canada, is there's an increasing trend of claimants tending to make their claims at ports of entry upon arrival, which is a relatively new phenomenon compared to how it used to be the case. So in the past, refugee claimants used to come to a port of entry and not make their claim until after entry. But since 2022 in particular, we saw a significant change in that respect that carried through in 2023. And this year, I only have data up till March, so it remains to be seen what will be the case for this year. But that's a significant difference. And in terms of the role of the Canada Border Services Agency, in the last 2 years, you can see where we've significantly outstripped the actual Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada in terms of the processing intake of asylum claims. Of course, Canada has a long history of a humanitarian tradition and takes international obligations related to refugees very seriously. That being said, it is an unprecedented issue for Canada and for border services. Going back again, since 2015, we're looking at almost a 900% increase in asylum claim volumes. So on the next slide. So on this slide, just to situate people, because often when we talk about refugees, these two concepts get somewhat confused. So in the Canadian context, there's actually two refugee programs, if you will. So one is the resettlement program, which is a selection-based process that happens abroad. And, it could be an international organization like the UNHCR, for instance, that might identify and do a preliminary vetting of claimants and referral to countries who have resettlement programs like Canada's. And so with the focus of today's presentation, we'll be talking predominantly about the in-Canada asylum system. The CBSA in particular, we don't have that big of a role in the resettlement program. What we would do in that program is do security screening, for instance, and then arrange for the arrival of resettled refugees under that program. But predominantly, the work is done by the Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship in Canada. On the right-hand side, you have a few data points on the in Canada asylum program, and for that program. Claimants cannot access it unless they're physically on Canadian soil. So that could either be at a port of entry or between ports of entry or within Canada itself. And when you look at the volumes, significantly, the in-Canada asylum system volumes are actually about 2 to 3 times higher in recent years than the resettlement program. And so as a bit of a shorthand, you can think of resettlement as a planned asylum system, insofar as the government can set targets, and then based on those targets, it can receive referrals from private sponsors or from organizations or from a number of referral agents, but it can set caps, right? So if they wanted to, let's say, resettle a number of individuals from somewhere like Gaza or somewhere like Ukraine, for instance, which are programs that have existed, the government can open a program, set a cap, a lot of number of spaces, and then sort of close or wind down the program once it's reached its targets. The in-Canada asylum system doesn't operate like that. So because of the International Refugee Convention, which we'll see on the next slide, Canada has a legal obligation to process refugee claimants when they arrive on Canadian soil. And so that's largely, in previous years, been thought of as more of an unplanned migration route, in terms of you can make forecasts, you can make projections, but year to year, you can't really control the volume. And once they arrive, government officials have to process them under the law and the Refugee Convention. So on slide 6, I'll jump through this relatively quickly, but this gives you an overview of the legal framework that governs the asylum determination system. And so you have a multilateral refugee convention, the 1951 convention, that lays out sort of the high-level principles and rules for who is a refugee, who isn't a refugee, what the categories of persecution are that states who accede to the convention ought to apply. And then you have another international instrument, which is the Convention Against Torture. That outlines categories related to what we would call persons in need of protection, which is a sort of a subset of a refugee claim, but based on different grounds. And then in the Canadian context, you have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So all of those three pieces of legislation influence what was written into the Canadian Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and how it governs. So in Canada, you can't, like the way that you give effect or force to an international convention is you have to write it into Canadian law. And so you'll see various provisions in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that basically give effect to these three instruments. On the next slide. So another important policy tool that we have in a Canadian context is a Safe Third Country Agreement. And so what this agreement does is a bilateral agreement between Canada and the United States where refugee claimants who arrive first in either country are required to make their refugee claim in the country of first arrival. And so this is an agreement that was largely inspired by similar agreements, for instance, in the European Union and elsewhere. It's been upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada as legally sound, and relatively recently, in 2003, there was a change to that agreement so that it now applies along the entire border, whereas before it would only apply at official ports of entry. That created a loophole, if you will, in terms of allowing irregular migrants to cross between ports of entry and not be subject to that agreement. So some of you might have seen that. It was a relatively high-profile issue that took a number of years to resolve. But in March of last year, the agreement was revised. The law was changed to reflect that new agreement, and then you can see here the material impact that it's had on claims. If you look at, for instance, the pre-March 25 period of last year, we were averaging about 4,000 to 5,000 claims a year, and over roughly 40,000 irregular migrant claimants in 2022. And then when the new agreement came into force, in subsequent months, that number has dropped to the hundreds, if you will. So the average monthly volume is about 123, but it ebbs and flows usually as the seasons tend to go. And so an agreement like that's very important if you kind of think about it in context of the previous slides, where the majority of asylum claims are actually arriving at official ports of entry now and making their claim there. That's a significant issue for border integrity, and just there's a lot of unintended consequences that happen with that in terms of clogging up airports, affecting the traveler experience, trade facilitation, and the like, in terms of having to divert resources towards refugee processing to deal with a relatively new phenomenon that was overwhelming the CBSA's capacity at certain ports of entry. If we turn to the next slide. So here we have a little bit of an illustration as to what could make somebody eligible or ineligible, actually ineligible to make a refugee claim. And this is inspired by the 1951 convention again. And so there's categories you can see on this slide. Somebody is ineligible to make a refugee claim if, for instance, they have protection in another country, or like I just mentioned, if they arrive in Canada or from the US and didn't make their claim there. If they're inadmissible for serious reasons like security, terrorism, human rights violations, and the like, they could also be ineligible to make a refugee claim. And then in the Canadian context, once you are determined eligible, a number of social supports kick in for refugee claimants. And so that includes healthcare coverage, educational, work study programs, and legal and social assistance services. So on the next slide, we're just going to fly through a little bit of the continuum here for an asylum claim. So if somebody makes a refugee claim at a port of entry, they'll see a CBSA officer. That officer makes a determination if the person's eligible or not. And if they are eligible, then they get referred into Canada for a determination of their claim. And in Canada, neither officers of the CBSA nor of the Immigration Department have the authority to make a refugee determination. That's a process that's reserved for the Immigration and Refugee Board in Canada, which is Canada's biggest independent administrative tribunal. And so the case gets referred there for a refugee protection hearing. During that process, the CBSA, which it can be a sort of a quasi-judicial process, and the CBSA has a role there to represent sort of a government position if we identify, for instance, reasons that the person should be found ineligible or excluded from protection. So let's say if we find that the person maybe was involved in a serious non-political crime, they've been referred to the board. Our officers, our hearings officers, will go to those hearings and work with the Immigration and Refugee Board in order to articulate the reasons why, in the government's view, protection ought not be afforded to that person based on the statute and the categories in the law. The next slide just gives a bit of an overview of the removal process in Canada. And so at the conclusion of your refugee hearing, you can appeal in some cases if you have appeal rights. You can get judicial review if the court gives you leave for judicial review. If you've exhausted all the avenues available to your to a negative decision on your refugee claim, then you become subject to a removal order. And so persons who claim refugee status and are found to not be refugees have a legal obligation to leave Canada immediately once they've exhausted all of their avenues of recourse. And so the CBSA in that process is responsible for working with the failed refugee claimants in terms of facilitating their removal and departure from Canada. And just a little side note in terms of claim acceptance rates. In the Canadian context, it varies quite widely depending on the country from which the claimant is arriving. And so there's just a few little examples there based on the current data, which is all publicly available. There's about a 98% acceptance rates from claimants from Iran. And on the relatively lower end of the scale, you can see there that about 41% of claimants from Mexico have been accepted by the Immigration and Refugee Board. And then if you turn to the next slide, so I'll go through these relatively quickly. This slide and the next slide talk a little bit about some policy interventions that Canada has put forward to deal with some of the pressing issues related to refugees and volume intake over the last few years. And so on this slide, you see refugee processing is Canada's most expensive immigration application. And to receive 70,000 refugee claims a year, just as a for instance, which is the funding decision that was made in 2024, it took an investment of 743 million over 5 years and 160 ongoing. And just 2 years prior to that, to get the funded level of claims up to 50,000 a year, it took $1.3 billion in investment over 5 years and 331 million ongoing. So it's a very expensive program. And recalling a few slides before, we're seeing intake in the range of about 140,000. So the system, as it stands right now, is funded by about half. And so you can imagine the pressure that puts on organizations like the CBSA and the Immigration Department and the Refugee Board, and not to mention the frustrations it might generate for some claimants who experience some delays in receiving a decision on their claim. So how to handle those things? Funding is one part of the solution, but the other thing that the government of Canada has been moving forward on is things like IT investments to streamline the application processing, minimizing touch points between the various departments involved, and automating certain other processes like the cancellation of immigration documents, for instance. And lastly, funding and process streamlining alone isn't enough to bring claims down to a sustainable level in the Canadian context. And so I'll close off the presentation just if we turn to the next slide on the most recent policy intervention that we had been working on and came into force in 2023. And that's to reiterate the importance of visa policy. And so that's an issue that, or visa policy is an issue that was very much in the public spotlight in the Canadian context about a year ago, particularly with respect to Mexico. And I've mentioned before that they tend to be on the low side of acceptance rates from the Immigration and Refugee Board, and a lot of Mexican asylum claimants tend to abandon or withdraw their claim, which means they come, they make a claim, and then they don't follow through on the claim. And in the Mexican context, that there was a significant increase in Mexican asylum claims in Canada. So in 2016, for instance, when we had a visa with Mexico, we received about 260 claims a year. And if you fast forward to just before the visa policy changes of last year were implemented, that jumped to 25,000 claims a year. And that was 17% of the entire Canadian asylum claim volume. And so last year, like I mentioned, looking at visa policy changes. Now, persons seeking to travel to Canada from Mexico need to have a Canadian or US visa issued within the last 10 years. And if they do have that, then they're able to get a facilitated travel approval through what we have in Canada called an electronic travel authorization. I don't have current data on that, but there's been a significant drop in asylum claim volumes for Mexico since these changes have gone in. And just to give you an idea of what some of these policy levers can achieve in terms of cost avoidance and volume adjustments in a refugee claim context, the forecast that we had last year for Mexico only was that this policy change would result in a net cost avoidance for governments in Canada in the range of $5.6 billion over 10 years. And so I think my concluding remarks would be asylum is a really important program in a Canadian context and internationally. And it's something that is going to just continue to be more important as world events unfold. We're seeing, rising conflicts in multiple areas across the world, and there's a number of policy levers that governments need to be aware of and be empowered to utilize in order to sort of calibrate the degree to which border authorities have to and can and are able to process those volumes that they're seeing, so that it doesn't become a bigger border integrity issue for Canada and for our partners. So I'll pause there. I'm a little bit over 20 minutes, I think. So hopefully that's all right.
Richard, Christian here. A couple of discussion points, perhaps to kick it off while the participants enter their questions in the chat. Is the system fit for purpose, given that this system was designed at a time when travel was relatively complicated and expensive, and when communication imposed significant transaction costs, and where effectively the refugee system is being, at least in a significant number of cases, used as background immigration for economic immigration purposes by individuals who would not normally be able to qualify under normal immigration rules. And how do we, in a system where the public increasingly does not have confidence that it is actually serving the broader Canadian I think, interest or so. I don't know if we want to frame this diplomatically. And 2.5 billion more people in the world over the next 25 years. Those people being born in places that are already today, politically, economically, socially, infrastructure-wise, unsustainable. And you've already mentioned just the financial costs, let alone the other costs the system imposes. What is the way forward? Because as nice sort of as the regime that we have is, it seems to me that this regime, either in Canada nor elsewhere, is sustainable, and that there's other approaches that are emerging in Australia and the European Union, and also now from the US, for instance, effectively forcing people to make their claims outside of the country. Anyways, I realize you're limited in what you can or might want to say on this, but I'm just trying to open this up as sort of one possible point of discussion.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Christian. And I should preface this by saying I'm speaking as myself as an individual, like I'm not representing the government of Canada in any of these interventions. In terms of fit for purpose, I think that's a question that is being asked more and more, right? And when you look at things like the trend we've seen in the last 3 years with 70% of refugee claims being made at a port of entry, that's an unprecedented sort of moment. It's never been that high since then, but certainly our system in Canada was not designed for that to be the case, or that to be the place where all of those claims are made. And just as a illustrative example of what that means, it could take a border services officer six-ish hours to process their function at a port of entry for one refugee claim, right? And so, and a lot of the time you'll see, depending on the movement, a lot of these asylum claims are focused on specific ports of entry, for instance. So like, Montreal or Toronto, or the land border in Southern Ontario tends to get a lot. So like, certainly when Canada's asylum system was designed, that was not the case at all. So you ended up with the majority of claims being inland, and the border infrastructure needed to have all of that volume at that we saw last year at a port of entry is not there. And so I think the system is evolving. I guess it's a question to see what pace it's going to need to evolve at to be sort of more fit for purpose. And the examples that we just gave about the Safe Third Country Agreement, for instance, like that was a response to adjust the system to try to match it to contemporary realities. So I think there's a lot of work underway to try to adjust the system to match what's been happening. Some of you may have seen as well, in the Budget Implementation Act, actually just this past summer, a number of legislative changes were attempted to get through in the Budget Implementation Act to better handle asylum system volumes. That legislation did not pass, actually, and so there's a difficulty in terms of getting the necessary reforms through in a minority parliament, I think, is another part of the question. Certainly internationally, there's a lot of efforts being made to move from the application process abroad, or make agreements with other countries, for instance, so that a refugee claimant can avail themselves of protection in a third country rather than in the country to which they've made a claim. So, we monitor all of these trends and events. But I think in the Canadian context, it is part of our humanitarian tradition that, the asylum system is very central to that. And so I'm not sure that we would see in Canada something similar to what's happening in other countries, especially in Europe, where, they still don't, the volumes in those countries are still exponentially higher than the volumes that Canada is receiving, right? So even when you see 140,000 in Canada, like relative to what some countries in Europe get, and the phenomenon that they have to deal with being closer to some of the conflict zones, I think it's important to look at what's happening there, but I'm not sure that it's determinative or necessarily the case that, you know, the solution in the Canadian context ought to emulate kind of what's being seen in other regions where their geography might be significantly different.
Thanks for that reflection. We do have a question in the chat. I think you can probably see it there too, Richard, but I can read it out. Thanks for the question. It's been observed that a significant amount of resources are spent on asylum seekers. What is the perception, or I guess from your views, from the Canadian perspective, from citizens regarding this spending, which is seen as diverting funds from other public services such as healthcare, education, housing, meant for citizens? So a bit of a contentious question there. So feel free to reflect on that, how you see fit.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's fair to reflect on those things, and certainly in a discourse in Canada, there has been some public discourse around affordability in an immigration context. And so, like, as an example, I think it was about 18 months ago or so, where there was a fair bit of pressure on the permanent residence system in Canada. And so that's a system where, you know, the people through sort of legal avenues to make an application to stay in Canada permanently, they can apply. And around the housing and affordability issues that Canada's been experiencing, there was a fair bit of public sort of sentiment around putting a cap on that. And so the government, I think, committed to a 500,000 permanent resident cap per year for the foreseeable future. I haven't myself, and I haven't myself seen that the same level of public discourse has materialized in an asylum context. Those two plans are different, and I was going to go through that a little bit, but I kind of had to speed up. So in the Canadian context, the 500,000 permanent residents, that includes Canada's resettlement program. So when I talked about the two streams before and like the 50,000 resettlement program, that's baked into the 500,000 per year permanent resident intake cap. It doesn't include the 140,000 in Canada refugee claimants. So when you think about what's the real number for people seeking permanent status in Canada, whether through a refugee program or through a permanent residence program, the real number is closer to about 160,000 if you were to think about those two things together. So publicly and in the media, I'm not sure that those two things have been married together, but I'm not sure it's going to be married together in the same way because of maybe some cultural affinity for the humanitarian tradition, but it remains to be seen how the public might react to some of these things.
And for the students, maybe if we have time after the two presentations for discussion, I'd love to hear from, the struggles that Canada has for the refugees is, of course, nothing compared to some of the countries that some of the participants on the course are from. So I'd love to sort of, once we're through the two presentations, hear about some of your experiences, some of your thoughts on this. Todd wanted to intervene here as well.
Yeah, just have a quick question, Richard, if you're comfortable answering this question. I know that every country struggles with people traveling for nefarious means, whether they're criminals or transiting contraband goods, whatever they may be. What do we do in Canada to, train or provide tactics to our frontline workers to deal with this sort of stuff? Whether it's fraudulent passports or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I can't get into like tactics on training for sure, but there is, and I'm happy to share it here. So at the previous course, Ben's course on the law of borders, I kind of went fairly in depth on sort of the border continuum and where the various touch points are in terms of interdiction and ability to sort of assess assess individuals against the criteria, but also to intervene when you find kind of sufficient risk indicators, right? So it's a pretty complex continuum and a complex answer, I guess, but there's a significant amount of training. And I think the other speaker, I think you mentioned, was a visa officer and had different roles. So along the continuum, there's number of checks, right? And so when you think of the border, it's like you have to think about it as multiple touch points. And, you know, it starts with like a visa screening process or an ETA screening process. And then we receive, depending on the mode of travel you're getting, you can get advanced information and do an additional risk assessment based on other indicators in terms of the passenger information and their reservation system information that they use to book their tickets to travel to Canada. So there's another risk assessment point there. In the CBSA context, we also have liaison officers abroad who can intervene with airlines and with commercial transporters when we identify people of interest. So there's multiple touch points and different training programs that exist along that continuum that sort of together as a comprehensive strategy for border management help us identify and mitigate risks ideally before they arrive in Canada. But of course, no system is perfect. And so sometimes you have to deal with the cases when they arrive in Canada at a port of entry or even within Canada. So we have capacity and programs all the way through from before somebody leaves to after they've arrived that kind of help identify those signals and let us respond to people when they come to our attention.
Thanks so much for that, Richard. I think if there's no further questions at this stage, we might pop over to Duncan, and then we should have time for more questions for everyone after as well. So keep thinking about your questions as we go through, and we can have some more conversations after the next talk. Over to you, Duncan, assuming you can hear and see us okay.
I can see just the room. Can everybody hear me?
Sound like you're in a bit of an echo chamber. There you are.
Okay, here we go. Okay, technology. Can you still see me?
Yeah, you found a back office at the airport there to hide in?
Yes, I did actually. I'm actually at work, but I'm not representing CBSA with my opinions and so forth here. I just want to make that clear. Airport, this time of year, 11,000, 12,000 passengers a day. We're not the biggest airport in terms of international arrivals. That would be Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. But we're seeing more and more people arriving who have problems with documents, who are not here for genuine reasons. Sorry, I'm trying to get out of the screen show. Anyway, okay, perfect, there we go, thank you. And as Richard said, some of that can be mitigated before people arrive. One of the objectives of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act for temporary residents is to promote tourism, promote visitors, international business, trade, students, workers, and family reunification. However, what's been developing in the last 2 or 3 years is Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, who issue these visas, have almost gone overboard with their approval rates. When I worked in Singapore, albeit 10 years ago, we were dealing with Bangladesh and Malaysia. Most Bangladesh visa applications were paper applications, and it was fairly straightforward to sit through your caseload during the day. People who've been here before, people who have family, pretty well an automatic approval. Then you have the ones that are going to be an automatic refusal. Take, for example, 22-year-old, works at a shop, minimal income, no brothers or sisters, and his application is to fly from Dakar to Montreal on Qatar Airways in first class. He's staying at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel, which is a 5-star expensive hotel in Montreal. While he's there, he's taking a day trip to Banff by car. It's a 3-day drive. He's going to Winnipeg to see the beautiful illusion of snow in August. That's a straightforward refusal. Every day, we're now seeing people who have presented that type of visa application, getting visas and turning up at the airports here in Calgary. And when you ask them, how are you planning on traveling from Calgary to Vancouver when your hotel is in Regina, they have no answer. And this is usually when they claim asylum. Because you're going to offer them an allowed to leave, you're going to offer them to go home, to change the visa paperwork and try again. But they've been caught out, and now what their essential joker is to say, I need refugee protection. And if you look at the 1951 convention, you have to be outside of your country of residence or citizenship, or with that well-founded fear of persecution based on the factors. Generally speaking, they are not based on those factors. It's just, well, I can't go home, I borrowed money, I was looking for a job when I got here, and if I go back, I'm going to be embarrassed. So there was a question about confidence in the refugee program. From my point of view, and from the point of view of every frontline BSO here at the airport, the resettlement program is solid. It's balanced. The risks are taken, are mitigated. We help them, we provide services for them, we provide charter flights if needed. And we should be looking at increasing that number, but trying to decrease the in-Canada claims. And one of the ways we can do that is to have more human intervention in the visa process. At the moment, consultants and agents, they know what CBSA and what IRCC, are looking for in a visa application. And they're getting triaged with a certain level of artificial intelligence. So it's getting passed, it's getting approved. And as soon as the agents, the consultants see this is working, they will increase the number of visa applications, they will submit more, and it almost becomes self-fulfilling. The process to triage visa applications sees all the boxes being ticked. The consultants see more and more visa applications being approved, and more visa applications are approved. There needs to be a robust checking of visa applications and asking for paper copies and calling people in for interviews on a basis that you can a random selection. You submitted this, or you are going to do this, this, and this. Because most visa applications these days are submitted electronically, and there's no way of physically holding a passport or checking the documents and they're manufactured. I had a gentleman the other day, had absolutely no clue what was on his visa application. His passport showed great travel history, it was the consultant or the agent who had just taken various pages from a passport that had stamps, that had visas, put it all together, submitted it electronically. And the guy freely admitted he just paid for this visa. His intention is to look for work when he got here. As soon as he said no, he claimed asylum. So the objectives for temporary residents to promote tourism and family reunification, facilitate trade and students is having a negative impact on the number of refugee claimants, ports of entry, 2 or 3 dozen claimants off of one flight alone. Calgary Airport, we've had 268 refugee claims this year alone. January was the busiest month, 65, and 27 in June, and at least 3 this month because I processed them. One thing I will say, though, the resources that are being put in to the port of entry processing, so One Touch, is certainly saving time. Richard's quite right. It could take up to 6 hours to process one claim if you've got to fill in all the forms, the intake forms, you need an interpreter. Now, with One Touch, provided it's a low risk, we can expedite it in an hour to an hour and a quarter, which allows us to process high-risk travelers, the traveling theft organizations, the people who are coming in here to commit crimes, traveling on false documents. So that has really helped out. The public perception, that was an interesting question that was asked. I think that the public perception from people I know outside of work is the resettlement program is fine, they like it. But when they hear of the abuse of the in-Canada refugee claims, they're horrified. And again, it's not that people shouldn't seek protection. It's just that people are using it as a method of last resort. If they can't get in with the intention of looking for work, with the intention of heading south to the US, the fail-safe is, I want to be a refugee. And a lot of them don't carry on with that claim. We had a family from the UK claim asylum, and then they never came back for the rest of the process. It was just a way of, well, you're looking at putting us in remand for the night and sending us to do that. They didn't come back in Ontario. One thing that we could look at doing, what Canada could look at doing, which would facilitate travellers, facilitate the speed at which visas are issued, and increase the security to Canada, would be to remove physical counterfoils from the passport and just issue e-foils. The reason I'm saying that is that we had a family 2 days ago. The visas had been cancelled by IRCC. The visas were not marked. They looked as if they were okay. We asked how they got on the plane. They talked about a back-to-back discussion. Airport in Africa thinks that an airport in Europe is checking the visa. The airport in Europe thought the airport in Africa had already checked. So there wasn't no board message in the system, but The airline agents didn't believe the no board because the visa was in the passport, and they arrived. By having everything electronically linked to the passport, if it's cancelled, the airline has to phone somebody to say, well, I'm getting a no board message. And that would speed up the process of people getting visas, getting authorizations to Canada to visit friends and relatives. It would save people sending their passports into the visa application centres with the potential for them being lost or delayed. And it would be an easier step for Canada to control visa issuing. So, another thing that we could look at is biometrics and facial recognition and strengthening that at ports of entry to beat any counterfeit passports or people who are coming in as imposters. The kiosks we have do facial recognition, but there's a belief that it's not as accurate as it should. During the time of the pandemic, no problems at all recognizing somebody wearing a face mask, and it doesn't leave a lot of confidence there. So I'm just looking at the time. Anybody want to ask me any questions at all? Just go right ahead and throw it out there for you.
Thanks so much for that, Duncan. I think it's a really the real on the ground focus on this, and you touched on something that we've been talking about a lot this week, is this idea of this pushing out of borders as well. So a lot of what should be happening away from the border, and that border should be the last line of defense. But we're seeing it being utilized a lot more, needing to be this first line of defense because of what's happening beyond that border. And then also drawing on this, the idea of digital borders as well, and this real digitization from whether it's the visas and the e-visas that you've proposed there, which is, I'm surprised Canada hasn't gone that way yet. Australia has been e-visas for since I moved there 6 years ago. I had an e-visa for that, and the airlines do talk to each other through that and can be cancelled in there. It did, however, almost result in me being refused entry onto my flight because despite being on a Canadian passport, the Australians did not think I should be able to go to Canada. So there was that. So it kind of swung the other way. That was fun. But yeah, and then the biometrics at POEs, and then also this integration of AI that you're talking about. I thought we had a really interesting conversation the other day, Duncan, where you're talking about the use of AI in these visa applications as well, where I think a lot of these problems, and it got me thinking, a lot of the problems around the application, so going to Canada to fly into Montreal and then drive to British Columbia, AI is going to know that that's not possible. It's going to be helping to generate these kinds of applications. So it actually makes the job a lot harder, needing more human intervention to actually say, well, what kind of data went into this? So I'll wrap it up there if we have, just for me anyway, but questions did you have comments or?
I saw Trudy nod at a number of points. I saw some of the others sort of nod. So this might also be a good opportunity for you to share sort of any experiences sort of around this, any ways that you can think about how Canada can actually, help either countries or help sort of internationally with sort of the struggles that other countries have. So
we do have a question for Duncan in the chat here. Duncan, has the presence of migrants in Canada raised any security concerns while they're being processed at the borders or inland processing? I think you'll have some insights on that one.
Yeah, that is a good question. It depends on what country they're coming from and the citizenship. also the questions that you ask and your general knowledge of what's happening in the world. If you're coming from Iran, where are you in Iran? What did you do? We know that military service is compulsory, but what was your rank? If you're in the police, what did you do? We had a gentleman who was flagged as being police, and he was an elderly gentleman, and it stems back to the Amritsar massacre in India, which is going back several decades now. So that has a question there. The one downside I see to One Touch is the giving them 45 days to submit their front-end screening to complete their forms. Now, we do an initial refugee intake, but I'm just going to suggest that if you're asked the question, have you ever committed genocide or war crimes, you're probably not going to say yes to that question, because you're going to have 45 days to change your identity, change your name, just not bother updating your address, and then you're in Canada and we have to look for you. So does that sort of answer your question?
Great, thanks, Duncan. And while others, oh, sorry. Are there more questions from anyone in the room? Because I'd also like to give a bit of a chance. We still have about 15, 20 minutes if there are more questions, conversations to happen here. But I'd be interested to hear some of Richard's reflections on that talk as well. And then Duncan, if there was any kind of dialogue between the two of you in that sense as well, coming from two different perspectives there. Get it? Complementary.
Yeah, happy to jump in, but I see there's a hand up. So is there a...
Oh, sorry. Thank you for identifying that. Nora, yes, if you wanted to go ahead and ask
I have a question for Duncan. So knowing that nowadays the Russian-Ukrainian war, the Palestinian-Israeli war, and other war zones in the world. So my question to Duncan, do you keep track of people who post about whatever they did in a war zone in terms of genocidal crimes or, killings, kidnappings, raping? So do you keep track of what people post? Sometimes they are like dual citizens, like a Canadian and Israeli, a Canadian Ukrainian, Canadian Russian, whatever. And know that many of these people come home to Canada here, to practice their life as Canadians, but they already committed some kind of a crime that under the international law defined, yes, as a crimes against humanity or like war crimes or genocidal crimes. So do we know or have a system to track whatever these people are proud of? They posted, as part of their daily life or whatever they did in the ground. And knowing that these people could also show some, threats when they come back here to Canada. So this is a question that always I was thinking of, and if you have any idea.
Well, if the Canadians are going to enter Canada by right, the National Targeting Centre may pick up there and flag somebody for terrorism, for war crimes, for smuggling. But the lead agency on that would be the RCMP, not CBSA, because they would enter by right. We would get involved if they have anything with them that relates to hate crimes or war crimes or anything like that have physical presence. So leaflets, T-shirts, digital media exams, but that's incredibly onerous level threshold to look in somebody's phone. But yeah, I mean, it can be identified, but in terms of say prosecution or full investigation, it would be RCMP. If they're a foreign national, or a permanent resident, then yes, CBSA would have more authority to look into them, to report them for sections 34, section 35, 36, 37, so war crimes, organized crime, etc.
Thanks for that. And there's another question in the chat as well from Julianne Deer here, and she's in the room with us right now. So based on your experience, what advice would you offer Caribbean countries on processing Haitian refugees? Any insights?
Quite a few while I was at Montreal. You definitely need a Creole interpreter. They don't speak Quebecois or French as fluently as you would think. They understand it, but they need Creole. Honestly, most of the people that I processed who were from Haiti were opposed to the government or just leaving the US because they didn't like Donald Trump, or they felt that they were being persecuted in the US simply for being there illegally. I would look at a streamlined process if you can. So have initial setup to streamline it, to see if they meet the criteria of the Convention on Refugees or whatever grounds or reasons that they could have in a Caribbean country who they'll accept, and then just look at fast tracking them. Haiti is such a mess at the moment between the economic disasters that are happening there, the political, the climate change, that I have no real. I couldn't really offer a solid ground there.
Anyone else with a question?
Or a comment or some lived experience of your own.
I have a comment here and some kind of experience, not lived experience, because I work with a civil organization here in BC, helping filling the sponsorship application for some refugees from the Middle East. And one major step in the process is actually there is a clarification forms for the sponsored refugees to fill regarding any military services and all of his social media accounts and the names of all the military officers, training places, locations. So at the beginning of the process, like at the beginning of my experience, 2017, 2018, the form wasn't there, actually wasn't a mandatory form to fill. I believe after 2020, they introduced this form, and it is part of the screening check or the security screening check that these people have to fill, particularly that the adult males. So this was something new for all of the people who help in the process. And I was like thinking why this step wasn't introduced at the beginning and why particularly like after 2020.
I think a version of that form has always been around. I can remember something very similar to the military service tables going back to 2010, 2009, when I was processing refugees. Why it suddenly came into more widespread use in 2020, I don't know. I know that IRCC sometimes update their forms and their packages, and then we just are using their forms. We complete the forms that they want us to. I noticed that in the touch kit, they do have the military service, police service, government service forms more readily available. So it could just be that somebody was going through a forms package and realised that they weren't routinely being asked these questions.
Yeah, I can jump in maybe a little bit on that one too. So I think like some of those questions from a visa context, they're like they can be context specific and indicator based. So like as a for instance, in the Canadian context, a couple of years ago with respect to Iran, the government of Canada recently designated Iran as a regime that engages in systemic human rights violations and terrorism. And so when things like that happen, although they're relatively rare, in order to process applications from people from a certain country where that type of a designation is in place, the questions needed to assess admissibility evolve. So I don't think it will be unusual as like global conflicts emerge that you'll see increased lines of questioning in certain regions and in general in order to be able to assess the admissibility provisions that exist in the Act.
Yeah, Richard,
Yep.
you spoke about the border as being border security as being touch point. I think you used the word touch points along a continuum.
Yeah.
We want to, we have contact point A, B, C, D, and E before we finally get to the border itself, which is we like to think of as a final line in the sand sort of thing. But it dawned on me as I'm just sitting here thinking out loud to myself that each one of these touch points, the more you increase them, the more points of exploitation you also increase. These are points that can also be exploited by organized crime groups, terrorist groups, or whatever else. As you think towards the future of the border and the future of these processes, how do we think in terms of how we can mitigate any of these points of exploitation? What needs to shift, or it could be open to anybody in the audience also if they have best practices that they've seen in their own agencies as well. Just thinking about that out loud.
Yeah, I think that's so. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think of the border as a continuum, and it's I think it's been a long-standing sort of slogan almost in Canada that sort of seems to have fallen by the wayside. But the concept of pushing the border out and that in the Canada-US context has been talked about for quite some time. I think that's good and needs to probably be reinforced. I think maybe some of those principles over a little bit of time have maybe not been as present of mind as they once were for a period of time. One of the things that in my mind though is different with today is, we've and refugees is a great example, but there's other examples in a customs environment as well where the notion of the border as the place where like I think in the past, in the old way of thinking, you would think of the border and then you would push the border out and you would apply these like various layers of screening with the end goal of hopefully not minimizing the degree to which an inadmissible person or inadmissible good or whatever would not come in. I think the reality with the pace of travel, the hundreds of millions of people on the move, I'm not sure that model is fit for the future or even today. And I think one of the things for me that I'm thinking about and that I think we should all, when we're thinking about border studies, should be thinking about is what can you pull in and what do you have to pull in to actually discharge your mandate, to live up to international obligations, and how do you pull in a safe way, and how do you conceptualize a border service environment where you have a full suite of border authorities, but it's actually within the country? And I think in a Canadian context, that's a big issue we're going to have to grapple with, right? Because like the right to privacy, for instance, there's a lot of jurisprudence on the right to privacy at the physical border is diminished because you're there. But when you're facing these volumes and these complex cases that could take hours and hours and hours to resolve, you're not going to resolve them at the physical line. So you need to bring them in. But do you have to bring them in in a way that diminishes your authority to actually do the due diligence you need to on the case or on the imported good or on the anything like that. So I think for me, and refugees is a great example, right? When we had Roxham Road, we had to, which was where all of the irregular migrants were coming in, we had to basically like set up a humanitarian infrastructure there. We couldn't process them. At one point, we had to rent the Montreal Stadium in order to process refugee claims there, because we're going to get these movements, we're going to get these flows, and you're going to be overwhelmed. And so, what is the policy framework that you need to have to initiate to be able to handle those events, either on an acute moment by moment basis when there's a significant event that arises, or or even on an ongoing basis. So I think that's one thing to think about. I guess just going back to some of the comments from Duncan, I think the and multiple vulnerability points, like on one hand, when you look at like processing these volumes and using AI, that does introduce a vulnerability, right? And so there might be that might be something that emerges, and the ways you have to deal with that are different. Digital visas, that in and of itself could, for instance, open up a whole other vector of risk in that respect. I can say for sure those are things that are being looked at. Like there's a thing called digital platform modernization that the immigration department's looking at. There's some material online about it, but you can think about it's a multi-year sort of initiative to look at digitizing much more of the immigration and refugee experience from an application perspective. So with those things, yeah, the sources, like the areas for a vulnerability increase. But again, it goes back to the volumes. Physically interviewing each and every person, like you might have done when you only got 15,000 claims a year, in an environment where you're getting 150,000 claims a year. The tools you use and the mechanisms you have to deploy to sort of do a risk assessment and to process the applications they're different, just because the old model might not be scalable to what we're going to be seeing.
If you wanted to jump in, Duncan, on any of those, do feel free.
Yes, yeah. When you talk about touch points, I'll just give you a quick example from Calgary Airport. If you fly in from Amsterdam today and you have salami, you're guaranteed to talk to 5 people. If you fly in from Amsterdam, have lied on a visa application, and intend to work illegally, you talk to no one. So again, you have to have a series of random inspections, roving, talking to people, to have people more concerned that they'll be stopped and maybe not make that application in the beginning because the risk is there. Do I speed? Yes. Do I run a risk? Yes. But if I know that there's going to be a cop on that corner, then of course I'm not going to, because I could get caught. And that's just the touch points today at Calgary Airport.
Thank you so much. I'll just ask Richard, Duncan, or anyone in the room, do you have any kind of final thoughts, or should we wrap up the session? Any final questions, comments, parting thoughts? Good. All right, I'll take the silence as a no. So I just want to thank our 2 speakers. Thank you so much for bringing in 2 different yet complementary approaches to the issues. And thank you for the questions and dialogue in here as well. And with that, we will wrap up this session, and we'll be back in 20 minutes for the next session on climate change, border security, to wrap up the day. All right, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you to our speakers.